Please welcome the Atlantic's Margaret Lowe.
Hello, good morning. As you just heard, I'm Margaret Lowe. I'm president of Atlantic Live, and we are the team that brings the Atlantic's journalism to life on stages across the country. And I am so happy to welcome you to Blueprint, our 4th annual summit on infrastructure and transportation. And this morning, we're going to focus on one pressing issue, climate change. It's an issue of paramount importance, and we're already witnessing the impact. In August, people all over the world, from New York to Norway to South Korea, experienced record-breaking heat. In September, Hurricane Dorian, the second strongest Atlantic hurricane in modern history, ravaged the Bahamas. And just a few weeks ago, Venice experienced the worst recorded flooding in its 1,200 years. And we are woefully unprepared for this. Our infrastructure is not built to withstand these forces. So today, we're going to explore these challenges facing our communities as they face off against changing climate. And we have a magnificent lineup of speakers to tackle this topic. We'll talk to leaders in energy, infrastructure, transportation about the steps that they're taking to prepare for this future. Before we begin, I want to say thank you. Today would not be possible without the support of our underwriters, and they are BASF, United Technologies, and McKinsey & Company. Please join me in giving them a great round of applause. And beyond the stage, we have an extraordinary audience in this room, too. Leaders in energy and transportation, scientists, community organizers, architects, engineers, the list goes on. And we would love you to all join the conversation on Twitter at Atlantic Live. You can use the hashtag Atlantic Blueprint. And I know that you're going to have many good questions of your own, so we're going to leave time for that after every session. I want to give you a download on how we're going to do questions today. So if you'll indulge me, I usually tell you to put your phones away and turn them off. I'm actually going to ask you to take them out. And this isn't mandatory, but we'll hope you'll join in. Open a browser. And once you've opened that browser, type in the word Slido. That's SLIDO.com. It's up there on the screen, SLIDO.com. Is everybody with me? Yes. Is that a yes? You are quiet. We got to wake you up. Okay, next type in Atlantic Blueprint, one word. On your screen, you're going to notice an option to ask questions. This is the technology we'll use throughout the morning. You can tell us who you are and what you do. You don't have to, but we do like to know. And we want to hear from as many perspectives as possible, so please don't be shy about sending in your questions. With that, let's get rolling with our first session. It's called Feeling the Heat. For that, please welcome the president of the Large Public Power Council, John DeStasio. He is here with Atlantic staff writer Robinson Meyer. Robinson, John, take it away.
Thank you. It's always good to have the infrastructure people try out the new technical solution, you know?
That's right.
So we're here today. I want to make sure kind of everyone in the room is on the same page first. We were just talking about how you actually live in PG&E country. Can you remind us a little bit about what's happening in Northern California? And you can get a little technical since our audience is a little technical themselves.
So obviously in California, we're experienced increasing number of wildfires over the last several years, and I know each year people read about the impacts. Where I live is in a relatively rural community, grape-growing community in the between Sacramento and Lake Tahoe. So we're in a critical fire zone, and really what's happening is a convergence of a lot of unfortunate factors. Climate certainly is one of the large ones. Some forest management issues over time. Also the fact that fires have been suppressed as opposed to allowing them to burn, and that's in large part because so many people now live in critical fire zones that it's almost impossible to allow these fires to go unchecked. So, and then you add on that the economic issues related to the statutes in California with inverse condemnation and strict liability. And it really creates an unfortunate convergence of circumstances that leave many people out of power for significant periods of time.
And inverse condemnation, can you
Yeah.
just remind us what that is?
So basically, even if you maintain your system,
Yeah.
and even if you've met all the state standards for safety and reliability, if your facilities cause a fire, you're still liable for the entire fire. So it's a pretty onerous standard, and that's what's ultimately caused PG&E to file for bankruptcy. But there are liabilities related to the Camp Fire and other fires that they're responsible for. It's a staggering amount of money and property loss and human impact.
So there was just a report from the California Public
Yeah.
Utilities Commission that they were not fully keeping all their equipment up to
Yeah.
date. Is that right? Would that still affect this liability issue?
Well,
I mean, the liability issue is like no matter what, I suppose.
So even under a comparative negligence standard, they would have been liable to the extent their facilities were not properly maintained.
Yeah, exactly.
But the point is that under strict liability, even had they done everything right, they still would be in the same position.
So you lead the large public power council, which
Yeah.
includes the 26 largest utilities in the country. One of those is Sacramento's
Yeah.
municipal public utility. Have they been affected by what's happening at all?
So I was formerly the CEO of Sacramento, and they're affected, but in different ways. They have far less of the rural mountainous terrains. They serve basically 900 square miles urban, suburban area around Sacramento.
Yeah.
They do have some high critical fire danger areas, but typically that's going up to where their hydro facilities are, and they're not heavily populated areas. So they don't share the same risk that a PG&E does, given the diversity of geography they support.
Do they rely on any of that on any of PG&E's distribution
No.
technology? No, they're
No.
totally good. What are the big challenges for utilities in Northern California, whether they be public or private, or frankly, as someone who is familiar with public utilities, like what are the challenges that you're facing right now?
Well, there's several challenges, but there's actually a lot of opportunities. California's kind of tried to lead the way in transitioning to a cleaner environment since AB 32, the landmark climate law in 2006. California's reduced its greenhouse gases significantly. However, I think they've thrown so much at it. There's a lot of solutions, and they're not really fully integrated. So you may have a very aggressive renewable portfolio standard, now a clean energy standard, a lot of specific mandates around technologies. And I think there's a little bit of a cautionary tale that I think now California's trying to move to more of a comprehensive all-in approach. And I think that relative to a clean energy standard and relative to a low carbon future, getting the outcome right.
And where do the costs from the renewable portfolio standard, from the mix of policies that California has used, where do they show up?
Well, frankly, the cost of renewables, there's a couple different factors that happen.
Yeah.
Renewables were really ramping up at the same time the cost of natural gas plummeted.
Yes.
And so it actually created this issue where gas prices lowered a big price in the portfolio, added in renewables at that time that are higher cost. It was a muted effect. However, now renewables have come down to where they're at parity or better. So, I think their economy's been able to grow, and they've added population. And one could argue that whether it was luck or great planning, that they have produced some impact in terms of cleaning up their environment.
I mean, I think they have a much cleaner grid at this point than the country on average.
Right. California they actually had an emission standard that effectively banned coal several years ago.
Yeah.
And then they've had increasing renewable portfolio standards, but there's also been a big push to electrify transportation as well. So,
are the challenges you saw as the leader of Sacramento's utility in California similar to those faced by other public utilities?
I think they're similar, although you have to have respect for regional diversity and where people start and what their access is. Of our 27 members across the United States, plus Puerto Rico, They have very different resource mixes, and so and what is their availability of some of the resources that California is blessed to have.
Can you walk us through what
Yeah.
kind of utilities make up your group? Because Sacramento, my understanding is much of the public utility work that happens in this country is in rural areas, which Sacramento is not. And so what's the mix of your public utilities like?
So maybe just to step back for a second, if you look at it, there's about 50 or so investor-owned utilities in the United States, but they serve about 65% of the population. So they're very big, multi-state organizations. When you get to rural electric cooperatives that you're referring to, they are a type of a public power system, but normally they're very small, and they were actually started because people didn't want to string lines out there for very, very limited populations and revenue. So there's maybe, I don't know, 1,000 or so of those, and then there's another 1,600 municipalities of all size. Our organization is probably 27 of the largest of the municipals. Every one of them, we have cities like Seattle, New York, Sacramento, Los Angeles, Austin, and 2 cities in Florida. These are typically bigger population centers, and from a risk profile, our members tend to look a little bit more like an investor-owned utility because they're much more complicated, larger asset-owning systems.
Yeah. And so are they? What's their own power mix looking like?
I think we're about 40% carbon-free, but we have everything. I will say, I don't know of a single utility in the United States, and while there may be one, I'm not aware of anybody that's seeking to add coal. In fact, they're trying to figure out how to get off of the coal that they may have invested in. And if you were unfortunate enough to invest in it in the recent past, then you have a significant challenge to figure out your glide path off of it. We do have many that utilize a combination of natural gas, hydro, some nuclear, and then of course renewables, solar and wind. But generally, I think the predominant mix of our systems are gas and renewables.
Do you think the fact that utilities are public leads to better climate outcomes?
I do, and I'll tell you why. Because right now, historically we followed policy and regulation.
Yeah.
And policy and regulation has provided uncertainty such that you turn to say, okay, well, I want to be responsive to my consumers, and that's what public power systems do. And consumers generally, when I was in Sacramento, even before things were as urgent as they are now, 80% of our consumers wanted us to take action on climate. And so their elected representatives, that became very much a part of our mission.
And are public power companies able to translate that into action, you think, better than private utilities?
I don't know. I would say some lead, some lag, and the same with, I think if you look across the industry, it would be hard to say this sector of the industry is outpacing. I think the investor-owned utilities are somewhere around 30-some% carbon-free at present. But I would think that they're also on the same path, I think, to try to move to a cleaner energy future.
Yeah, I've heard both that public utilities might lag because there's no investor pressure, there's less kind of carbon risk.
Yeah.
You're just able to pass along those expenses. But I've also heard people say actually having public utilities makes them much more responsive. Do you feel like not having that huge kind of carbon risk from investors at this point is maybe allowing private utilities to get ahead?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure of how investors reflect their interest relative to reducing carbon. I do know
it hasn't worked great in PG&E.
I know running a public utility, we had 2 public board meetings a month, and people showed up to your boardroom. So there was direct interaction and accountability to consumers. I'm not saying it's a better model. I'm just saying the interaction was very different. If you have something in a state like California with 40 million people,
Yeah.
and you have an issue, you can go to San Francisco to the Public Utilities Commission, but that's at least an arm's length bureaucracy in between the ultimate organization.
Have you been following any of the policy ideas that have come out? It seemed like mostly in the Democratic primary and mostly
Yep.
on the left to publicize power to some degree. I think Bernie Sanders has proposed to just build kind of renewable capacity through the DOE authority until it just takes over kind of overall demand. Have you been following this at all?
I've followed some of it. I'm not familiar with Senator Sanders' proposal specifically, but I do know that I know with the Climate Action Caucus and some of the discussions that are now starting to happen. I mean, I was involved when Waxman-Markey was introduced.
Yeah.
I was involved in when Kyoto was discussed. So for me, this has been a conversation that's been going for 20 years now. What I do think to me holds some promise. It does seem that there's a recognition now that there's not going to be a silver bullet. You cannot just build renewables and say we're done here. There's been a lot of studies that suggest you need to clean up the power supply system, which is about 28% of the emissions. Mm-hmm. But then you have to deal with industrial electrification. You have to deal with electrification of transportation and mobile emissions. That's going to take a lot more focus on an outcome to reduce carbon versus an outcome to add a certain kind of resource.
We're going to go to questions in a minute, so get out Slido and start to ask them. But first I want to ask, do you see a way to move off? Certainly the decarbonization question is very big. Do you see a near-term migration away from natural gas without policy? Or is gas just so cheap that it's going to keep being a big part of the grid?
I think gas is going to be a big part of the grid in the future. How it gets used is going to be different. Again, I would suggest that there was a recent study done in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest by E3, and it basically suggested the optimal path forward would be to keep gas on for the reliability purposes to be able to help manage the system, as well as the existing carbon-free resources like hydro. So again, I think I would prefer, and I think our members prefer, a conversation around, let's stay off of this discussion around specific technologies, and let's look at what is the outcome we're trying to achieve. And if you're trying to achieve an optimal reduction in carbon, maintaining affordability, reliability, and meeting environmental stewardship, I think gas at some way is going to be part of the mix going forward.
First question, we hear much about California's permitting process. Can you outline the permitting process to replace the aging transmission infrastructure? And do you feel like that helps or hurts public safety given what we know happened with the Camp Fire?
Well, California has a regulatory-rich environment, and so when you go to site facilities,
just spread throughout the pot.
Yeah, that's right. It's very expensive, and the other issue that's faced is not only the typical environmental reviews that can be very time-consuming. If you want to build new transmission, you're really looking at 10 or 11 years, start to finish, just to get through all of the regulatory process. If you want to replace generation, the South Coast Air District is a non-attainment air district, the LA Basin. And so there were 6 gas-fired plants on the coast that had once through cooling. They need to be replaced. The problem is you couldn't build the replacement. You had to unplug these first because you didn't have the air offsets to be able to build the new. And there was a prohibition on having both in place at the same time. So there's a lot of complicated factors. They're not, they can be overcome, but they're very challenging.
Are there any, is it easier to permit cleaner technology right now than transmission or than fossil?
There's still land use issues.
Yeah. I know it's California.
No. When I was at SMUD, we built a 230 megawatt wind farm, and we were getting the transmission to get the power out of the wind farm was really a complicated thing. Building the wind farm was fine, but you still needed to get the power out to where it was added to the grid. And then you also introduce land use issues, you introduce raptor issues. So unfortunately, there's no free lunch. These things all have trade-offs and they all take time to do.
Next question, do utilities across the country coordinate on climate issues? And I want to ask this two ways. I want to say first, is there any coordination happening around best practices?
I don't know that on best practices. I do know that I think the utilities do coordinate. I mean, we just met with EEI, met with our environmental task force to talk about the types of things that they're doing. There is a big focus and a big support for moving towards a cleaner grid, but again, having it be more tech neutral, more resource neutral, and also moving towards beneficial electrification of a lot of other things, transportation in particular.
Do you find that different utility groups, I mean, do you feel like your interests are substantially different from EEI's, are substantially different from?
I think our interests are somewhat different in that because we're public power systems, and again, it's no fault of the investor-owned utilities, their regulatory construct is very different.
Yeah.
Because when people talk about grid modernization, and I know there's been efforts, but regulatory modernization needs to happen as well. This is the same system we've had for 100 years, and it's basically based on a rate of return on installed capital.
Could you say what does modernization mean in this regard?
So for me, grid modernization really means looking at the combination of digitization, the combination of building in resilience.
Yeah.
One of the things real quickly is that in the replacement of the system that was damaged in Puerto Rico through Maria, it's very difficult under even things like the Stafford Act and FEMA to be able to not replace like for like, although there's a real important opportunity when a system is really destroyed to be able to build something for the future. I think in one of your articles you cited that, the grid that we have lived with for 100 years was not designed for any of the dynamics that we're dealing with today.
There's no, I mean, all of our infrastructure for the last 100 years is not designed for the next.
And I will tell you, in PG&E's system in California, one of the complicating factors is they build a system which is a radial system. So you basically, from the substation, you may go out at the radio for 30, 40 miles. I might be in an area on that circuit that has no fire danger whatsoever, but 30 miles from me is critical. But guess what? I'm going to go out as well as the other people. So doing some of these things surgically is very difficult given the way that the system's designed.
When you talked about optimal reduction in carbon, are you thinking about temperature goals at all, whether that be 1.5 C or if you're working in California? I mean, the state government has tried to remain abiding by Paris Agreement, which would be 2C. Do you think about those kinds of temperature goals at all? Is there a number for optimal reduction in carbon?
I don't think that in our sector, I mean, at least within our constitution, we don't talk about those numbers. We all know we need to get to something close to 80% reductions of by 2050, and that's the path that's probably guiding most people.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Rob.
To discuss how resilience can work for everyone, please welcome Anjali Mahendra, Director of the Ross Center for Sustainable Cities at WRI, Lisa McNeely, the City of Baltimore's Director of Sustainability, and Carlos Martin, a Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute. Here to lead the conversation is journalist Kathleen Koch.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, panelists. I am so excited to be here today to talk about resilience because my hometown on the Mississippi Gulf Coast is probably one of the most resilient small towns in America today. That because it was destroyed by Hurricane Katrina and virtually had to be rebuilt from the ground up. So because of new flood maps, new zoning, new building codes, what was rebuilt higher, stronger, smarter, further back from the water. We have a protective seawall. The bridges are higher. But Carlos, I know that starting over with a blank slate is not exactly the blueprint that we really hope cities will have to follow. So what would you say are the most successful strategies toward becoming climate resilient that cities should be following, and are enough of them following these strategies?
And the answer to the second question is easy. No, there aren't enough cities that are doing enough, and most of the cities aren't doing enough on their own. I would say, to be fair, though, most cities are trying to do what they can.
With what they have.
With what they have. There are some so we've been evaluating cities throughout the United States in terms of their climate adaptation policies. There are things that cities are doing internally that I think are very helpful, as well as what they're doing on the ground, trying to get projects in place, trying to rethink how their neighborhoods are structured.
So what kinds of things? I mean, if they haven't started, where should they start?
The first thing they should start with is understanding the science. What are the risks that they face, not just sea level rise and severe precipitation events, but also heat waves, potential drought, as we see in the Southwest. And there are at least 15 climate change effects that I think we often forget with the visuals that we see about sea level rise and hurricanes. And so it's important to think about all the consequences. That's just to start off with. And I think thinking through how to de-silo within their city governments, I think, is the next big challenge.
So making climate resilience, really folding it into everything that they do.
Into everything, and making sure that your public works person talks to your housing person, talks to your public health person. This often doesn't happen, especially in very large cities that are huge bureaucracies. It's hard for people to walk down the hallway and say, how do we figure this out?
Lisa, does that happen in Baltimore? Are things siloed? And what are you doing to make Baltimore a more climate resilient city? I happened to be there in 2003 reporting on Hurricane Isabel and the effects. It pushed a 10-foot storm surge into the city and terrible devastation in Fells Point, some in the Inner Harbor. So what are you doing to make it resilient not only to that, but to the day-to-day effects of climate change that you're seeing?
Yeah, we're working on that issue. I wouldn't quite say our departments are siloed from we don't want to talk to each other, but we're siloed because we have so many problems that we're trying to address. There are large infrastructure problems. There are the problems that you know from the news around the safety, the vacant lots, but what we've started where we can. So my office is in the planning department, and so we've integrated climate adaptation into the all hazard mitigation plan that FEMA requires us to do. And so that's a first step at bringing everybody together to try to look at what are the priorities to do on this. We're working to then integrate those strategies and actions into our capital planning program, which unusually is also run out of the planning department in Baltimore. So that gives us a bit of an entry point in terms of having agencies think about how they're spending that limited capital money.
Well, speaking of limited, how hard is that in Baltimore right now? Because of the infrastructure crisis, you touched on that. I think you're about $1 billion behind in spending just on general maintenance. So how do you even afford mitigation and resilience planning?
Well, one of the things we're working to do is to get people around the table to do an integrated planning so that when if Department of Public Works is looking at stormwater projects improvements, we know that they're also aware of where there are needs around flooding issues, so that those things can kind of happen at the same time, as opposed to it assuming that there's two pots of money, because there's really only the one
getting more
small
bang
pot.
for the buck. Okay.
More bang for the buck. Yes.
Anjali, let's look internationally. How would you say cities on the international level are doing when it comes to addressing climate change? Are they facing some of these same challenges that U.S. cities are?
Absolutely. That segue on, how do you find the resources to do this? It's common to Baltimore. It's common to, any of the major cities around the world and the growing cities that we're talking about. The bigger challenge, I would say, in the international context is that if you look at where urban populations are growing right now, the fastest, they're the countries that have the least resources. Sub-Saharan Africa, we're talking about South Asia, we're talking about Southeast Asia, some of Latin America. You have urban populations growing. You already have a crisis in terms of access to services. There's severe deficits. There's certainly lower resources. These are lower income countries. And you have pretty strong, severe governance challenges. Just having the mechanisms to plan and deliver on those plans do not exist in so many of these cities. So there are some shining examples we can talk about. There's places like Surat in India, there's Cape Town in South Africa, where unfortunately it's always been driven by a crisis. There was a day zero in Cape
Just
Town.
like in the US.
And the institutions come together, the agencies come together, and that spurs action, and that's great, but we don't want to wait for that crisis. Same thing in Surat, year upon year of flooding. A river runs through the city, and now they have early warning systems integrated into their planning. Their infrastructure delivery takes climate risks into account. So there are a few good examples, but far too few still. That's the problem.
Carlos, I saw some headlines in the last month, and one gave me hope, and one was depressing. One was talking
Welcome
about
to the climate world.
one was talking about Norfolk, Virginia, and some other vulnerable areas, also Vermont, where they were taking a new strategy, and the headline said, a tough strategy, saying no to developers. But then I saw a Wall Street Journal headline that says, despite wildfires and drought, California keeps building. So how do we get through to elected officials? This is a long-term problem. There's no guarantee that there is going to be a payoff while they're still in office for these mitigation measures, for taking steps to make their communities climate resilient.
Craig Fougat, former FEMA administrator, used to say, the way he would convince cities and states is by thinking about their long-term revenue, where they're going to get their tax base from. And so it's a way of thinking not just about immediate development opportunities, but how you're actually investing in the current communities that already live in your jurisdiction. It's ultimately going to take a lot of leadership and really inspiration among specific politicians and elected officials. And there are examples of places, and I always quote Satellite Beach, Florida, where the mayor and the city manager are very conservative, to use the vernacular climate denial kind of community right on the coast, and the mayor and city manager said, we have to do something about this. We're flooding all the time now. And basically stepping up to the plate and saying we have to make hard choices, regardless of how you feel about what the sources are.
And even when those tough choices reduce your population, I mean, what about managed retreat and buyouts?
That's the next frontier in climate adaptation plan, and I think that we're barely just beginning to have the conversations around. There are only 2 or 3 examples of formal federally funded relocation.
Right. Louisiana and Alaska.
Exactly. And a lot of states are actually have been doing this for quite some time, right, through specific buyout programs, et cetera.
Charlotte.
Yeah, I think the challenge is how connected that and committed that elected official is to the communities, to all the populations that live in their jurisdiction and her or his jurisdiction. I think that's the real challenge, and how that's done in a fair and open and transparent manner is going to be something that we need to resolve.
Lisa, how hard have you found it to get the elected officials' attention on this issue in particular?
So I think we have people in the city right now who understand the connection of they understand that connection to the long-term solutions that we're trying to implement really are that the steps we can take now can also help with some of the shorter-term sort of emergencies and crises that we're facing. But we also see climate adaptation or events that are consistent with the climate models. I think yearly we already see an increased number of heat wave days. We see increased riverine flooding from flash flooding. Fells Point got 5 inches of rain in about an hour earlier this summer and flooded because of the infrastructure backup. So those connections are there on the newspaper every day as we try to make the case for additional steps to be taken.
But you're having to make the case, and I guess that's what I'm worried about. I mean, your own mayor, Jack Young, it was in August after a storm. He's quoted as having said he was unconcerned about the threat that was presented to the waterfront development by some of these extreme weather events that are increasingly occurring. And that's got to be troublesome. You know, when it looks like, according to experts, they say that by 2050, there is going to be regular flooding in the waterfront area of Baltimore, 2 or 3 days a week, just sunny day flooding.
But what Baltimore has been able to do, because you would think that we would be a city that would, where the knee-jerk reaction would be, you can't do anything that would slow down development in the city. Well, a few years ago, we put in flood regulations that were well above what the federal government requires, and we enforce them, every day as we move forward. And so businesses are having to do more than the federal government requires, and so they see that connection, and it's not something we get the pushback on.
Anjali, right now in Madrid, the UN climate conference is underway. I imagine they're talking a lot about city resilience to climate change. I'm wondering, though, how heightened now the level of concern is with this new report that came out last month, where they basically discovered a more accurate way to calculate land elevation using satellite technology, satellite readings. And they found that 40 million more people than they had calculated in the past are actually now going to be in the path of high tide flooding on a regular basis by 2050. Bangkok, Shanghai, Mumbai, Basra, Iraq, Alexandria, Egypt. I mean, has this created a new sense of urgency?
It's, just talk about making the case. I mean, this really adds to that. But I will say, over the last couple of years, WRI ourselves, I mean, we've been gathering this data on how many more millions of people are going to be subject to 5 meters and 10 meters of sea level rise in coastal cities, growing coastal cities which are already heavily populated, Cairo, Dhaka in Bangladesh, and now you see results like this. So I think it absolutely needs to heighten the sense of urgency. But I think a lot more work needs to go into taking that data and making intelligent policy based on it, and creating the capacity to understand the data among decision makers, planners, practitioners. All of us have this responsibility, activists, advocates, to see how this data can be utilized effectively. And this is, again, where it's not just a US problem, but internationally, some of the developing world cities, there is just no technical capacity, very limited technical capacity to take the science, which may be available to you, localize it to the city scale. Often these data are at the global scale, they're at the regional scale, country level data. Localizing it to the city context has been a major challenge. And then within that, starting to look at the impacts on segments of the population, disadvantaged communities, vulnerable communities. That further sort of layer and nuancing of interpretation is needed to kind of guide the policy. It's not happening fast enough, and I think we all need to join forces. I hope something good comes out of the COP conference in terms of an outcome and decision, just more ambition.
Carla, speaking of the disadvantaged in cities around the country, it is generally the poor who are the most vulnerable, and then they have the fewest resources to protect themselves, to prepare for climate change. So what can cities do to make sure that these efforts that they take, that they are inclusive and that they protect everyone in a city?
It's important to remember that adapting to the climate crisis is a social challenge as much as it is an environmental challenge. And I think all the approaches that we've talked about in terms of environment and science and policymaking have to always go back and look at how individual lives are affected. I've done several research projects with local environmental justice and climate justice organizations, and it's very interesting that a common thread that they always say is they're almost agnostic to the solution, whether it's tweaking their neighborhoods, actually doing broader infrastructure, or even relocation, as long as they're involved in the decisions that affect their lives and their families' lives and their communities' lives. So number one, actually listening to what your communities have to say, what solutions they come up with. I think too often, and as the window of opportunity decreases to actually do good, effective climate adaptation strategies, that opportunity to do effective community engagement is decreasing and having grassroots solutions come up. So the faster we do that, the faster we listen to neighborhoods and communities, the better. And then there are all sorts of other things, all the way through how do you get local citizens on the finance boards that decide which projects should get invested. How do you prioritize low-income neighborhoods that are most vulnerable for infrastructure development? Because These communities have historically, because of redlining and segregation in this country, been the ones to get the worst services, the worst public works, the worst infrastructure.
And they're usually in the most vulnerable locations,
That's
too.
exactly right.
Lisa and Anjali, before we go to the audience for questions, I'd like both of you to address that. You know, Lisa in Baltimore, how do you make sure that as you're making it a more resilient city, that those city resources are being spent equitably?
Right.
And then Anjali, I know you've been working on a report that looks at meeting the needs of the urban underserved and how that can make a city more resilient.
So in Baltimore, we're very aware of the parts of the city that are more vulnerable due to the decades of structural racism. And we put that at the forefront. We actually have a requirement to do an equity assessment of all of the city programs moving forward. And so how we do that in resilience, we have, and to Carlos's point about the community engagement, we've established resiliency hubs. We're at 7 or 8 right now, which are community groups in some of these neighborhoods who we are giving training, we're fundraising to give supplies so that they can be a resource in their community to make their residents more resilient. We also pay attention because those same areas are, can be 6 to 10 degrees hotter during heat waves. And so we work to try to see if we can help reduce that impact more. So it's at the forefront of what we're doing.
I should give a shout out to the Baltimore example. We've been looking into it, by the way, very carefully because you guys have excellent indicators to track equity-related outcomes of your climate plan, your sustainability plan. It's really, I think, something many cities can learn from. But yes, to your point about how we can kind of make climate action more inclusive, more equitable, I think Carlos's point is extremely important. Involve the communities. We work in the international context, and you have informal settlements that are not within the purview of any jurisdiction, any kind of planning. And you really need to work with these communities. They're the most vulnerable. In richer countries, too, you have disadvantaged areas, vulnerable areas. But I guess I also just want to make the point that, a few years ago, at WRI, we led this work, I'm talking about 8 or 9 years ago, that made the connection between environmental and climate action, greenhouse gas emission reduction, and economic benefits very clear. The two go hand in hand. It's not costly. In the long run, you have great dividends and returns from investing in greenhouse gas emissions reduction. Now the story is the same for climate adaptation. Now that we're recognizing that we're heading towards, a 4-degree warming world or whatever, with climate adaptation too, the dividends to action, I think we need to keep making that case about how its returns in terms of, development, its returns in terms of social capital and social resilience. We just need to keep highlighting that to make this case.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and FEMA makes that case. They say every dollar that's spent on disaster mitigation, prevention, will save you at least $6 in disaster recovery costs, at least, and sometimes it's $7 or $11. So it's such a great return on investment. Well, let's go to our questions. First one, and this is from Michael, on building new developments in climate risk zones. Why are banks and insurers willing to lend and insure? Who wants that one?
Because they have been doing it for a long time.
You're saying it's an old habit and we can't break it?
I think that's part of the issue. I think part of the problem is we're still relying on old models of what's possible instead of really accepting the limitations that we have and coming up with entirely new structures. Part of the challenge is also that we have a federal government that's been recalcitrant in making climate adaptation decisions, so they don't know how to respond appropriately to decision-making, governmental decision-making. I mean, there's always been an informal pact between insurers and government, where government will create infrastructure to protect communities, and insurers will insure the properties on that land that's protected. That's broken. And infrastructure is just, existing infrastructure is already in arrears by trillions of dollars, according to ASCE. Shout out to my civil engineers. So they don't know what to do.
But I don't think, at least as cities, we assume that will continue to be the case. I think that was part of the argument again when Baltimore set higher than federal standards on floodplain. That was to kind of help make sure that moving forward, the buildings where they've had the new construction, that they might still be insurable, and would see lower damages in the event of a storm or flooding.
All right, we have a question here from Anonymous. What is the role and good examples of community-led resilience projects? Community-led. I guess that kind of speaks a little bit to what you were saying, Anjali, doing projects with communities instead of for them.
Right. I think climate adaptation and resilience building is one of those things you'd really need stakeholders and decision makers at all scales working together, the very local neighborhood and community level, to the city level, to the regional, to the national, because the kinds of solutions that you're going to come up with are going to be much more holistic. You know, think about watersheds that suffer from climate risk, that supply water to cities, right? It's this whole chain that you need to kind of think about, which has actors acting at all levels that need to make decisions. And so we can't just say, we can say community-led, but it's really a partnership of actors that we're talking about, a partnership between communities and cities, a partnership between national governments willing to provide resources to these city neighborhood arrangements and things like that. And there's some great examples. Bangkok has implemented upgrading of all of its informal settlements through a system like that, funded by the national government, local communities working with the city government, multiplied it and scaled it up across many cities in the country and East Asia, throughout East Asia. So I think it's a powerful example.
And if I could just,
Please, you go.
sorry, I had my back.
We are so inspired by these local.
The advantage to be having your back to the moderator, you can jump the queue. I just wanted to add with our resiliency hubs, I wanted to make sure that these were not groups that we just sort of went in and they weren't doing any of this, and we're sort of, showing them how or leading the way. These are very often groups that we identified because that's already what they were doing. A church near some Freletting and Frederick Avenue just opened up its doors and started acting as a resiliency hub, and so we came in kind of behind to just introduce them to others and provide some resources.
These are the inspirations I think that we all have, and that's why we get so passionate about these specific cases that we've seen where actual local groups are doing something. So I just want to give a couple plugs for Southwest Workers Union in San Antonio. Was a neighborhood-based organization, developed its own climate plan for its neighborhood that became a model for the city of San Antonio's climate plan. Catalyst Miami, who's been advocating for Miami-Dade level and Miami City climate adaptation, sits on the board for the Miami Forever bond and decides what projects get funded from that. There's so much great activism. Rebuild by Design in New York, who's been pushing extensive community engagement on major infrastructure projects, including the ones like the Big U around Lower Manhattan. These are the things that we need to be lifting up, because that's, at least personally, what inspires me in the middle of seeing headlines that say bleak, bleak, bleak. So.
Exciting to see something good happening. We need that inspiration. Thank you all. Anjali, Lisa, Carlos, you're terrific.
And now, for a session produced by our underwriter, please welcome Grace Showalter, Vice President for Construction Performance Materials North America at BASF. Dean Evans, Executive Director of the Centers for Building Knowledge and Resilient Design at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. And Joseph Jones, Innovation Communications Lead at BASF.
Great, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Great to be here with Grace and Dean. So what we're going to talk about this morning is sustainable construction and the steps we can take for the future in terms of building a more resilient infrastructure. And I think just this morning, the New York Times had a story talking about the expectation that global warming is getting worse. And I think these topics play directly into what can we do about that from an infrastructure perspective. Certainly the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration feels the same way. They've said that they expect sea levels to rise at a higher level in the future over the course of decades, progressively worse than we're already experiencing today. And when you consider that nearly 40% of Americans live in highly densely populated coastal areas, this creates the scenario for further flood damage, for shoreline erosion, for storm hazards, and damage not only to infrastructure and property, but personal safety. So I think all these issues play into this question. And so, Dean, I would direct my first question towards you is essentially, what do we do about this from an infrastructure design perspective? What can be done to combat this and to protect our cities, in particular coastal cities in the future?
Thanks, Joe. I think that the issue, I think we need innovation both in technology and materials and in design. I think it's starting to happen. At the scale of new construction, I'm focused on buildings. New construction, I think, has an opportunity to sort of do a double whammy in the sense that if you design and build well, you can actually reduce the impacts of climate through energy efficiency and some of the other ideas we've talked about today. But in addition, if you can combine that with resilient construction at the same time, then you win and you prevent the impacts of these hazards. So for example, a project that we've worked on in Breezy Point, Long Island does that. It's a showcase, but it's an example of a project that can work that's both sustainable and resilient. That said, the big problem is the existing infrastructure that we've got, both at the large scale and at the building scale. How do you deal with that? One of the issues that we're trying to grapple with at our centers is the concept of opportunistic retrofitting, because we've heard from previous panels, there ain't a lot of money out there relative to the need. How do you take advantage of what you're doing anyway to improve its resilience and energy performance? We're looking at that right now with re-siding jobs, kind of a dull topic. Kind of a dull topic, is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Should I start over? For those of you who can hear me, I'm talking about something called opportunistic retrofitting. And at the level of the building, like say a home, people re-side their homes. There's 1 million re-siding jobs every year in the US. None of them are done for resilience. Very few are done for energy efficiency. If we could improve those processes, re-roofing, very basic stuff, we can improve both the climate impact and the resilience of those facilities. Likewise, at the level of bigger scale infrastructure, we heard a little bit before from Baltimore, from Lisa, the idea that you layer in resilience into your planning processes, and particularly your capital budgets. How do you optimize money you're going to spend anyway to make it more resilient? And this takes a longer term perspective. How do you do it over time? Same with your home. How do you think of a longer time frame in order to layer in resilience over time?
Yeah, so just to come back to Breezy Point. So Breezy Point is a location that was heavily impacted by a superstorm Sandy. BASF and with key partners came together, and we wanted to use this as an opportunity to build a model home. And we built it with existing technology. There is ample technology available today in combination with the right design in order to build for a more sustainable and resilient future. The key to the success of this project is actually that partners from various parts of the value chain came together to work on the same goals in order to educate and influence policy.
Yeah, and Breezy Point, for those here today, there's some video of that Breezy Point project out in the lobby in our display, so you can take a look at that. But certainly this idea of superstorms and severe weather events has become more pronounced over the course of the last year. New York, New Jersey, where Dean and I are from, certainly Sandy we're still recovering from that event. But you look at coastal California, Texas Gulf Coast, Florida Peninsula, all of these areas are being hit over and over again. So I guess, Grace, the question for you, are we at a point now in this cycle where we should really mandate that resilient design and construction criteria become a national mandate, and particularly in these heavily vulnerable coastal areas?
Yeah, so a strong mandate is a challenge because building codes happen at the local level. To me, a better approach is to go to locales where they're high risk. Perhaps the communities are familiar already with the risk and maybe even have experience in the past. Again, we have to work with partners because as industry alone, it's difficult to do. We have to work with designers, with architects, with local government, with the codes officials to come together and design and build and go from a locale up. Again, I really think it's about education and prevention. That's the key, starting with the high-risk areas.
Yeah, I agree. And actually on those fronts, in terms of mandates, I think there's some things that play in our favor right now. Unfortunately, the number of storms that have been occurring recently and the fires and everything else that's in the news all the time, including this morning, make people much more aware of this than they would have been maybe 10 or even 15 years ago. Superstorm Sandy came, it went away. There was a lot of action in Jersey and New York for 3-4 years, and then, pardon the pun, it began to ebb. Now it's in the news all the time, so public awareness is ready for this type of education and intervention. The second good news is that the codes continually upgrade, the building codes in the world I work in, based on field research. So they're constantly moving forward in these arenas, so they'll get better and better over time. And the third, for me just personally recently, I've been dealing with FEMA a bit, and I've worked with them over many years, and they're getting much more interested in granular mitigation at the community scale, which is very interesting for them in terms of trying to push people toward mitigation strategies earlier in the process, so they're not only reacting in recovery later. And FEMA's been engaged with this for a long time, but now it seems to be getting much more granular, which I think is good news for everybody out in the field.
Grace?
I can have that for a second. I think someone mentioned this earlier when we were in the back prepping, but did you know that for every dollar spent for pre-disaster mitigation, we save $11 in recovery? Also, in the last 5 years, U.S. spent $50 billion in disaster recovery, $10 billion each year. That kind of spending is not sustainable. Therefore, to me, key and meaningful progress has to happen with pre-disaster mitigation, with how to rebuild for sustainability and for resilience.
Yeah, well said. So I think we talked a bit about smart design, about smart retrofitting, the need for education and awareness, also the role public policy can play here. But I think there's also an important part that innovation can play in this topic, particularly in the form of, let's say, more disaster durable building materials and solutions. I know, Grace, this is something you work on every day. So what can you share with us and tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in the market, bringing to the market, and what we expect in the future?
There's really a lot of existing technology already available today, and we use them in some cases, but not enough, and not for disaster rebuild and for disaster prevention. So again, the key is about bringing these solutions with the right partners. There are many partners involved, so this becomes a challenge. And like I said, it really happens at a local level. It's fragmented, so it takes time for us to do this. For future challenges, I would tell you that companies like us, like BASF, and our partners in the industry, we have a lot of great sustainable solutions on the shelves already that we're not using today. Our company really employs an army of scientists and PhD scientists to do exactly this. We have developed solutions. We're also looking for needs in the industry to develop further solutions. So we're ready. I have no doubt that we can really meet any challenge that's out there for building better, for building for sustainability, and building for resilience. But the key is coming together with the right partners.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. I think that in the construction world and the building world, the opportunities are in front of us in terms of innovation and technology. If we go back to the example I was using on residing, right? Right now we're doing it as an energy performance enhancement, but if we began to set the performance parameters higher than that, how can you, in a re-roofing job or a residing job, make a home really resilient to, say, low-level flooding, nuisance flooding, normal flooding, wind, et cetera, et cetera. I think new technologies, if that performance goal is set up as a challenge, new technologies will follow. And the same thing is true at the bigger, from my perspective, infrastructure scale. We're doing a lot in the New York metro region about influencing policy, growing public awareness of the region in New York, New Jersey, and a little bit of Connecticut around these issues. And then that's going to lead ultimately to policy and then maybe regulation and other things, or just at least new policies. But what hasn't emerged is, okay, you get a policy in place for some kind of flooding mitigation strategy. It typically is strategies that are already tried and true. They've been done before. Industry's not at the table as these decisions are being made, and the challenges of some kind of riverine flood protection isn't percolating through into industrial innovation, job creation, those kinds of things. So I think that's a really interesting opportunity that resilience, sustainability, and green certainly led to that. And we see the kinds of innovation technologies that are happening now. I think resilience could as well.
All right, thank you very much. Well, it sounds like the challenges obviously are very real, in some cases getting worse, but there's also reason for optimism, I think, as we look forward. And so I thank you both very much for your insightful comments, as I'm losing my voice. And thanks very, very much for listening to us today. Thanks.
Step on your last comment.
For a discussion on ensuring green energy for everyone, please welcome Ted Trabue, Director of the DC Sustainable Energy Utility, and Kathleen Koch.
Morning.
Have a seat.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for
It's a
joining
pleasure
me.
to be here.
So you have described DCSEU as the only efficiency utility in the country combining energy efficiency and social justice. So explain to us what exactly you do and how unique it is.
Sure, Kathleen. Let me take a step back and describe the DC Sustainable Energy Utility, the DCSEU. About 11 years ago, the city passed a law requiring the adaptation of an independent contractor to come in and run the city's energy efficiency and solar programs. Prior to that, Pepco, who is our electric provider, and Washington Gas, who provides natural gas here, served all customers with providing them with energy and providing their energy efficiency services. You can understand the inherent conflict of interest.
Right.
So the city said, let's have an independent contractor come in and actually run these services.
And you're a nonprofit?
We are a nonprofit. I'm part of a company called Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, VEIC. We've been around for almost 35 years now, designing and implementing energy efficiency programs throughout the United States and in several provinces in Canada. I've been running the DC office here for a little over 8 years.
So it's
So
a
the
social
city-
justice component. Is
Right,
that
right.
what's so
The city
unique?
sets out, it's important to talk about energy efficiency, but the social equity, the social justice piece is just as important for me. And that's creating jobs for DC residents. It's utilizing local contractors to actually install the energy efficiency measures, the lighting, the air conditioning, the heating systems in the buildings. It's making sure that our low-income community is adequately served through the programs that we deploy in the city, and so that they get their fair share of the programs as well. And so it's really serving all of those needs, energy efficiency, economic development, job creation. This is very unique in the country. Most energy efficiency programs actually only seek out either electric efficiency or natural gas efficiency. Ours is much more comprehensive than that. We've gone around the country, and I was at a big conference out in California, our national conference, the American Council of an Energy Efficiency Economy. Is held every other year out in California, and there's a company called Energy Trust of Oregon that's somewhat similar to us, but I still maintain, and I'll challenge anyone to say that they are running a more comprehensive program than we are.
So you've been in existence now for 8 years. What would you say you've been able to accomplish?
Let's talk about the equity piece first. Over 500 jobs for District of Columbia residents. How many of you live here in the city? Good, almost half of you. All of you are ratepayers in the district, who are ratepayers in the District of Columbia, and whether or not you live in a single-family home or in a multi-metered building, you are paying part of an electric bill. And so the way we're funded is that there's a small surcharge on everyone's bill, with the exception of our low-income customers. All residents, all governmental entities, I'm sitting out here, we're looking over the White House now, the federal government, churches, hospitals, universities, the metro system, the water system, all of them pay into this fund that in total collects a little over $20 million a year for us to run our efficiency programs. We get about another $10 million a year for our solar programs.
Let's talk about the solar program. I love the fact that when you started back in 2011, excuse me, you, in Ward 7 and 8 combined, there were only, less than a dozen, I guess, solar panels?
Yeah,
but you have made incredible strides. How many are there today in Ward 7 and 8?
When we started our solar program back in 2011, 2012, we took a look at a map to see where the existing solar installations were in the city. And if you can imagine, for those of you who understand, the western side of the city had over 1,000 solar installations. Ward 7 and 8, which is a quarter of the population in the city, had less than a dozen. Ward 5, far northeast, also less than a dozen systems. So that's where we started our work, and we started installing these systems specifically on income qualified residents, those who were earning 60% or less of area median income, absolutely free of charge to the resident. And so as you can understand, there was some hesitancy when we started knocking on doors. We didn't have any advertising to speak of, and we started knocking on doors and saying, we're going to provide you with a free solar system. We've got this local installer who's going to come in and install it. People didn't know the name of our organization. They didn't know the name of the installers, and we're asking permission to come into someone's home.
So what happens? Doors slam?
Doors, get slammed pretty quickly. We thought that year if we could install about 28 systems, and we chose the number 28 because there was a gentleman by the name of Darryl Green. Many of you might remember him. Darryl played for the Redskins. He was running one of the solar companies that was working with us. He was number 28 for the Redskins. So we said if we can do 28 systems this year, we would declare success. We did 82.
Wow.
The following year, we did over 100. This year, we took about a 2-year hiatus from the work. We didn't have funding from it. This year, we're about at 100 as well. So all told, there are over 600 systems on single-family homes, income-qualified homes. And in addition to that, this year, we're also running what's called a community solar program. So we have about 80 projects that will come online by the end of this calendar year that will supply energy to over 6,000 residents here in the city.
You also help small businesses. Ben's Chili Bowl was one of the first to get a
Ben's
solar
Chili Bowl was
array,
one of the
right?
first businesses we helped. I'm sure many of you have been to Ben's. When we started in 2012, and again, we were an unknown entity, I called the owner of Ben's, Kamal Ali. He's a good friend of mine, and I said, Kamal, can we come in and redo the lighting in your building? And he said, Ted, if you guys want to come over, come on over. And so we went in there, installed all new lighting, and interestingly, Ben's runs almost 24/7. I mean, that's an operation. So we had to get in there on Sunday morning between about 2 in the morning and 7 in the morning. Those are the only hours that they were really closed because we had to get over the grills to actually do the installation of the new lighting system in there. But, things blossomed from there. We do a lot of work now with many of the largest institutions here in the District of Columbia. How many of you took an electric vehicle to work or to this building today? How many of you came in? I only see one.
I have a hybrid.
2. How many of you rode Metro? There you go. That's an electric vehicle, right?
Oh.
Okay. But, we're working with Metro, one of the largest energy users in the region. We're working with the Water and Sewer Authority, clearly the largest single user of energy in the region. Hospitals, universities, a lot of these places are running 24/7, and they really can use our help.
What about challenges, especially when it comes to installing these solar arrays on homes that in some cases they may be 60 plus years old and the roofs are not too sturdy?
Clearly, you have to go up and do the engineering work first. If you install a solar system that weighs several hundred pounds on top of someone's roof, and we get one of our typical 8 inches of wet snow, and that solar system then ends up in somebody's living room, it's not a good situation. And I can say...
Has that happened?
No, we haven't had that.
Good.
Because we have to go up and do the engineering work first. And, so you want to make sure that the roof is suitable. We've come up with new technologies that extend brackets from parapet to parapet on the roof that allow us to actually not put the systems directly on the roof, but kind of arc it across the roof. And then there are those circumstances where you need to do some remediation, particularly with our community solar work, where we are taking solar and putting it on warehouses, schools, churches, large facilities. Sometimes you have to do some remediation, and so that's part of the program as well.
On your website, I see that you also really try to encourage people to replace those energy guzzlers, the aging refrigerators and washers and dryers, and you have a lot of great rebates, but how do you deal with the fact that so many of the people who you're trying to help may not even have that money initially to invest in replacing those utilities?
Right. The reality is, you're very right. High efficient equipment is more expensive than equipment that's just running to baseline or meeting code. Even for some of our wealthier residents here in the city. Someone might say, hey, come over and see my new high-efficient car. I bought this high-end car. Or come and see, whatever. Nobody says, hey, come and see my new high-efficient refrigerator or, my new high-efficient boiler in my house. And so for residents, who are able to afford it, we put an incentive on the high-efficient equipment, trying to steer them to that equipment, even though it will be more expensive initially, it will be less expensive in the long run. But for our low-income residents, we're expending more money in that community, oftentimes installing those measures free of charge to the residents. In multifamily buildings, there's a cost share between the building owner and our organization. We pay probably about 60% of the cost. The building owners are paying about 40%. The residents themselves, and this allows the building owners to keep the rent down because their utility bills, their operating costs are coming down, and it allows them to keep the rent down in these buildings and preserve more affordable housing here in the city.
So do you think you've been successful in persuading DC residents that sustainability can be affordable?
It's an ongoing effort. I'd like to say we've had a lot of success. I would not say that we are by any means of the imagination finished with our work. There is still a lot to do. If you look at the city's very ambitious goals to reduce energy consumption by 50% by the year 2032, and that's not that far out on the horizon. The work that we're doing has been designed and funded to decrease consumption by about 1% a year. And the math is very simple. If we're going to get to a 50% reduction over the next 13 or 14 years, and we've been exceeding our goals, but our budget is limited. There are a lot of states here in the country who are pursuing energy efficiency. And it's not exactly a new game. You talk about your leaders like Massachusetts, California, Vermont, who are investing up to 5% of utility revenues in efficiency. The District of Columbia is investing about 1%, and getting 1% in terms of energy reduction is pretty much a very high standard. But I think the city realizes now it's time to invest more. The utilities are making petitions with our Public Service Commission to come back into the energy efficiency space, provide more work. The city itself is doubling, in fact, the amount of funding that they're going to provide for not only just energy efficiency, but for a green finance authority that'll come online either probably next year. The board of directors has been appointed by the mayor. So a green finance authority will come on board to help people finance these projects. We have building energy.
That should be hugely helpful.
It will. We'll have building energy performance standards that will actually talk to building owners and describe how much we have what we call benchmarking now, so we can actually measure how much energy is being used building by building. These building energy performance standards are some of the first in the nation that will then say to buildings, okay, if you're in the lower half or the lower quartile of efficient buildings, you're going to have to make some improvements to bring your buildings up to a higher level of efficiency. And so these rules will be coming online over the next few years as well. So it's not all just energy efficiency. Some is a little bit of a carrot and a stick as well. But the city is investing in this in a very large way.
Well, we're going to go to audience questions if you want to start submitting them on Slido. But as we wait for them, we already have one here. How do you see the role of mini grids and microgrids in DC? Perhaps a better resilience investment than rooftop solar alone? Great question.
It is.
From
If you look at the future of the city and the discussion, energy efficiency has been the nomenclature for about the last decade. The future is about decarbonization, strategic electrification. We have a grid here in the city, not just in the city, but nationally, that was designed and built by our great-grandfathers, basically for the use of our parents. And we're using it now. But the types of devices that we are using in our homes, the technology that we know is available to us in the future, the potential to develop microgrids here in the city is clearly something that the city is exploring in a very robust way. Grid modernization. There is a large proceeding right now in our Public Service Commission just about grid modernization and how we don't interconnect with the existing grid is one of those ongoing discussions here in the city.
It's very
and
smart.
it's not just
It
local,
increases
it's everywhere.
resilience.
Right. If you talk about some of the larger developments that we have, Walter Reed, McMillan Reservoir, St. Elizabeth's, where you have great potential to put in microgrids. We think that's clearly something that we will see in the future.
Next question. Renewable energy like wind and solar need good energy storage options. What work is your organization doing on that front?
We have worked with a few different organizations to talk about battery storage here in the city. Not necessarily strictly for the issue of resilience, but sometimes for shaving peak demand. You have those summer days here in the city where you know it's 90 degrees or more and the humidity is 80%. Everybody's tugging on an air conditioner. And we don't want to have a situation where we are, you just see lights starting to go out. I used to be the vice president of Pepco, and there were days like that where you would really start to worry about the capacity of the grid. We are a city that has grown in population by 13% over the last 5 years. Our energy consumption, on the other hand, has come down by about 3%. I'd like to pat ourselves on the back a little bit and say that we had a good bit to do with some of those statistics, but you still have these opportunities now to invest in storage. And we think that that can also help alleviate some of the strains on the grid.
Okay, and a question now from Anonymous. What would you like to do if there were more resources for investment in the utility?
I love this one. One of the pilot project that we're going to start in January or February is a decarbonization pilot. How do we start to move our residents off of natural gas and oil? We still have residents who are using oil here in their homes. And then get that to larger businesses as well. How do you switch them over to air source heat pumps? How do you make sure that this is a climate where air source heat pumps can actually still fully heat a home?
And that's more efficient than natural gas.
It's absolutely more efficient than natural gas. And then you can combine that with solar on the roof, and so you can actually bring down the overall utility bill in the home. And so we would love to do a little bit more of that. Our budget for that in the next year might be about $800,000. I'd love to see a little bit of an expansion of that. We're working with the Sierra Club to really see how we can make this work and work efficiently. It's difficult.
Ted,
the technology, up in New York, you get above that, it's where it's colder. In Massachusetts and Maine, you don't have the air source heat pumps that can fully heat the home. But here in the District of Columbia, we feel that air source heat pumps are going to be a good option for our residents in the future.
You've made such an impact in the city of DC, but when you look at climate change across the board, and certainly in the United States, there is so much more that needs to be done to bring down our carbon footprint. How important is it that the bigger players, multinational corporations, really get involved in helping create this, environmentally sustainable energy infrastructure?
I look at some of the customers with whom we worked here in the district. They are local in nature, but national in terms of their reach. I'll give you a good example. Marriott hotels. There are about 11 or 13 Marriotts here in the city. We've worked with each and every one of them on their sustainability efforts. And Marriott is a company that is global in nature. They are really making large strides. As you said, and I'm sure that someone talked about the report that came out earlier today, that the good news is that as a country, we are reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and Marriott's probably in most of the countries around the globe. But globally, we're not reducing greenhouse gas emissions. China and India are unfortunately, leading the way in terms of increases in greenhouse gas emissions. We've got to, if the goal that people agreed upon a few years ago in the Paris Accords is to cut global greenhouse gas emissions by about 8% a year, we're not anywhere close to it. And it's going to take a global effort to get us there. We're working locally here. We're very proud of the work that we've been able to do in this city. I look at our federal government as a national player, international player, quite frankly. And I applaud the work that our federal government has allowed us to do with them. And I know a lot of people say, well, current inhabitant, of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But when we went in there to redo the lighting in there, he was, and his team were very accommodating. And we've worked in there, and I think that, as the federal government has set a standard for leasing buildings here, that they have to meet a certain level of energy efficiency before they're going to lease buildings.
Right.
And I don't know if that extends across the globe, but clearly they do it here in the city.
Thank you for the great work you're doing.
Thank you for having
Ted
me.
Trebu.
It's a pleasure.
CSCU.
Thank you.
Next, welcome the Chief Technology Officer at GE Renewable Energy, Danielle Murfeld. She's here with journalist John Donovan.
Good morning, and welcome, Danielle. What I find really interesting about talking to a technologist from GE the GE is General Electric, and General Electric is a massive company, an aircraft carrier of a company, really, that has roots in coal-powered electrical generation. Thomas Edison was there at the start of General Electric, and he built America's first power generating plant in New York City, and it was driven by coal. So coal is in GE's story, and yet now General Electric seems to be seriously trying to turn the aircraft carrier towards renewables. And tell me what's going on with that, and where did the impetus come from, and how far along is the company?
Sure. So I'll start just by saying it's not the first time GE's done these big turns. I came to GE about 20 years ago specifically to work on LED lighting, to shift us from incandescents to LEDs, which the company has made a huge pivot around. So this isn't new for us. We've been reinventing ourselves for over 120 years. But where we are now is we have a GE renewable energy business that is global. We're in 140 countries, 40,000 employees, and we work across mostly utility scale, not small scale consumer scale, but we do wind power, both onshore and offshore. We do solar inverters, we do storage systems, we do hydropower, hybrid systems. We even do work on the grid and how to run the grid in terms of software, but also HVDC, analytics, a lot of capabilities that use the power and distribute it to customers.
So we just heard a panel discussion, as you said, on small scale. We were talking about Washington, D.C. and consumer level decisions. Your customers are not, strictly speaking, in terms of what we're talking about, consumers, but the companies that build the power plants, that build the electrical grids, et cetera. And are you getting... I mean, it would seem that you're making the judgment that there's a strong market for renewable infrastructure.
Yeah, so our customers are range mostly utilities, but historically most only utilities, but more increasingly we're actually getting large global companies that want to source their own power. And they can do that more easily with a more distributed, less centralized power source, such as a wind farm or a solar farm. So our customers are demanding it, and they can do a much better approach. You know, it's not the same emotional calculus that a consumer might do for their home and what goes on their roof. It's much more economically driven. So over the past couple decades, the cost of wind and solar specifically have been plummeting. There's been this exponential shift in terms of availability and scale and cost. And it's much easier for a utility or a CFO of a large company or a plant operator to do just to do the math. Just same way it was for LEDs and that transition. These larger companies can do the math, and it can be very analytic and less emotional, and they can make a shift faster because the costs are there.
Not that an emotional judgment in this area is necessarily a bad thing.
It can go for us too, exactly. Yeah.
But you're saying at the consumer level, it's much more, it's not about necessarily what I can afford, but do I want to do the right thing?
Right.
And for the utilities, it's a business decision.
Absolutely.
And why is it a business decision for utilities to move in this direction?
Well, so
where's the pressures coming from?
Yeah, so it's, we're in the midst of this exponential change. We have been seeing costs come down. Solar prices have come down 85% in the last decade. Wind has come down more than 50%, starting from a lower number. So 2/3 of the world's population live in a place where bulk power from solar or wind is cheaper to build and get new power from than any other form, including all the conventional forms of power generation. So when you're in the midst of this exponential change, you sometimes don't see that it's happening, especially when you're getting towards that knee in the curve where things start to really change fast. But we've already moved past the point where, the first tipping point, I would say, where it's generally cheaper to build a new wind plant or solar plant to provide power than to build a new conventional fossil fuel-based power plant.
There is a challenge, though, if a particular utility has only recently, last 5 to 10 years, built a coal-fired, gas-fired plant, to come to them and make the argument you should switch to renewable now when they built a plant that was supposed to last for 30, 40 years.
Right.
What about that?
Well, so I've just mentioned the first tipping point. That's the calculus that a company or a utility would make for developing a new power plant. The second tipping point is coming soon, though, and that is when a majority of our locations not only have new power, but existing variable costs. So meaning it would be cheaper to build a new solar farm or wind farm and operate it than continue to operate an existing fossil fuel-based plant or conventional plant. That's not yet. There are parts of the world that's coming quicker.
What does it take? What are the variables?
Cost. In fact, the best term that the industry uses is called levelized cost of electricity. LCOE is the short acronym for it. And it's a way to look at the total cost of ownership, including the building it, operating it, any fuel that you might have to spend over the life of the project, which can range from 20 to 100 years. Our hydro plants are very long life projects, and fossil fuel plants range in terms of their life. And it can help you make an economic decision for the levelized cost of the electricity you're going to get over the life of that project, which one's the better trade-off.
Is GE foreseeing or counting on a time when the U.S. is 100% renewable?
So I think that's a good question. I wouldn't say GE is counting on that or foreseeing it. There's a whole lot of debate about can the United States do it? When can the United States do it? And I think even people on both sides of that debate agree that getting to 80% is going to happen. It's not that formidable. It certainly will take a lot of investment, and it will take some big decisions around policy and grid codes and how we operate. There's a lot of things that will need to change, but getting to 80% is doable by all intents and purposes. That between 80 and 100, there's a lot of debate, and it's not about the technology. It's about economics and policy. Do we, and timing. How it will cost more to do it faster, to do it more with wind and solar. We need to bring in storage. We need to change how the grid operates. It's not an easy, quick answer to get to 100.
So the obstacles are not primarily technological at this point.
Absolutely not.
Theoretically, we could do it tomorrow.
Theoretically, yeah.
But it's a financial
It would be very costly to do it tomorrow, and it would take time to create the system that would enable it, but it can be done in short time. And I think the right answer is going to be different for different parts of the world based on what their current mix is, how their current grid operates, what they're blessed with in terms of wind and solar and hydro resources. So it's going to happen at different times around the world, but it's not too far off where we're going to see.
So the panel following us is going to discuss Africa, actually. So let's not discuss Africa, but let's set up the United States perhaps as a contrast to what we'll be hearing further down in the panel schedule. But talk about the U.S.'s ability at this point to go 100% renewable. Do we have strengths and advantages in that regard?
So we actually have some of the best natural resources in the world. There are parts of the world that have much better, say, offshore wind resources than we do, or much better solar resources than we do, but not by much, and we've got it all. So we do have hydro, solar, wind. We've got a lot of natural resources to work from. We've got a grid that will need modernizing anyway, because we're demanding more electricity, we're demanding more operational capability from our grid. We will be investing in digitizing more of our grid operations. So for us to turn that ship is not a huge shift. It's really about investing in the right growth, in the right next steps. And I would say the biggest challenge from an operator's perspective is connecting the country better. Because if you're making sun here and you've got a lot of wind blowing here, but people live over here, how do you connect? Because the sun's going to be shining for a lot of the time over our time zones, and the wind is always blowing somewhere in the U.S. So, and you've got dams and you've got great hydro resources in pockets. How do you connect that so you don't have these big gaps you have to fill with some other resource?
But again, it's technically solvable problem.
Yes.
When we were backstage and you were listening to some of the conversations happening out here, you remarked, this is really interesting for me as a technologist. I don't get to hear conversations like this very much. What do you mean by that?
Well, my world is mostly around innovating new technologies to bring the cost down, to evaluate how to make things more environmentally friendly. We're innovating around these solutions all the time. To hear the emotional side of the argument is something we don't really invest in our technology to get there, but we see it happen on the side. For example, we were the first company to build an offshore wind farm off the coast of the United States. It's just off the coast of Rhode Island. And there was a lot of discussion before that, when the permitting plan was in place, about what that meant for the local fisheries and and there was a lot of debate and discussion where the fishermen who used that waters were concerned about what that would mean. And now the whole community, especially on the environmental side, is pleased because we've created sort of an artificial barrier reef, and the number of fish and the population and the sea life is way better than it was before. And it's a whole different conversation now. That's something, as a technologist, I never was a part of, but I love observing from the side, because it just is much more, it helps the momentum of the whole movement.
I want to invite you now, if you'd like to put in some questions to the conversation. We're going to keep chatting, but as your questions come up, I'll work them into what we're talking about. And again, it's very interesting you make this distinction between emotional and economic decision-making. and that you see that the ordinary person is more operating at an emotional level. But I'm not sure whether this statistic has come up already, but pretty reliable polling shows that 74% of Americans support a transition to renewable energy, and that 51% of them said that they would be willing to pay 30% more in their electricity bills to bring that about. I'm not doubting the reliability of the data, but I am skeptical about people giving honest answers or answers that they'd thought through. But is my skepticism unfounded?
Well, I do think people are motivated by different things. What I've found to be the case, though, is when I really do talk to people in my community or in my work environment or our customers, people's feelings about this as they get educated about what's happening can be driven by a lot of different things. Certainly, a lot of us are motivated by the climate crisis and what that means and what we're going to do to change our energy mix. But when people find out that the economy is really, we've got 11 million jobs in renewable energy globally, and in the United States alone, for the last couple of years, the top 2 fastest job growth categories was solar installer, wind technician. So when people start to hear that, they think, oh, this might be good for my community, this might be good for the economy, or if they hear about what's happening in offshore and good for the environment, for the fisheries, all these little things can add up. And the Midwest is full of wind farms. My husband's from Iowa, and there's plenty of farms in his hometown that have wind farms above the crops now, and the farmers are making a really good income from that. So I think it changes people's feelings when they start getting all these other data points that support this positive momentum.
We have an audience question. When we're saying that renewables are cheaper than traditional power sources, which you said is a tipping point that's coming, are we also counting the cost of energy storage?
So I wasn't in that comment, although the cost of energy storage is coming down so fast that there have been auctions around the world where solar plus storage together was the lowest cost option. Generally, storage adds cost to put it out of the money when you're comparing it against raw options, but the cost of energy storage is coming down significantly, driven mostly by the volume demand from electric vehicles.
In order to achieve 100% renewable energy faster, does nuclear need to be part of the portfolio to overcome challenges from low supply of wind and solar? So first of all, there's an implicit assumption that there's a challenge from low supply of wind and solar. If you can take that on, and then let's work the nuclear into it as a backup.
So the biggest question, and it's sort of implied here, but maybe a better way to frame it is wind and solar are variable resources, and nuclear would be a base load or constant.
Night comes every day.
Exactly. And the wind does blow more often at night in most parts of the world, but they can't always be counted on to complement each other perfectly. So the question maybe better framed differently would be, can we really go without some of these really good baseline offerings that can give you energy no matter what? Now, something like a nuclear plant, you want to run constantly. You don't want to cycle it up and down only when the wind isn't blowing or only when the sun's not shining. So we have to do a little bit of balancing about our investments and how we want to use some of these other resources. Nuclear is a low carbon option, so it's not considered a variable renewable. It's not considered a variable renewable, but a lot of people think it's good because it's low carbon. I think because we want to do a transition that is economically and politically sound, you're probably not going to want to turn off things that you have that are good for your environmental goals. So I would say the question around whether you build new nuclear versus whether you keep nuclear running are very different questions.
And is GE involved in nuclear as well?
Yes, we have a nuclear business as well.
And there was such a stigma over nuclear 25, 30 years ago. Has that faded? Are we past that, or does that linger?
It's different in different parts of the world, where some countries are really dedicating themselves to growing nuclear, and some focus on a new sort of next generation small nuclear, which is a very, very different kind of challenge than conventional nuclear that takes decades to build, and the policy and permitting is very different. But there are countries that are avoiding nuclear completely and focusing only on the variable renewable energy approach.
How does GE see carbon capture strategies driven by the oil and gas companies? And are they a competitor to renewables?
So carbon capture doesn't compete with renewables. It's a way to reduce the carbon loading from conventional fossil fuel-based power generation. There are costs to that too, and there's a lot of debate over the value or the viability of it in different applications. We don't do work in that space, so I don't have really a lot to say on where GE stands, but I think we got to evaluate all options.
Will and does GE have partnerships on innovating transmission infrastructure?
So we actually have an HVDC business, and that stands for high voltage direct current. And that's a way, like most of our lines here in the US are AC, high power transmission lines. Moving to DC, you could probably put about 3 times the amount of power in the same right of way. And and it also helps connect between different regions better. So if we're talking about making a whole bunch of wind power in the center of the country and shipping it to the coasts, HVDC is the way to go. And that's really a big part of the growth for our view of transmission.
Greening power plants is easier than greening transportation. Does the technology exist to get 80% into transport? Is that outside your specialty?
No, I would say the way I think about this is how can you move electrification forward in all sectors? So in the transportation sector, it's about moving to electric vehicles, but how do you get the electricity to those vehicles? Are you burning coal? Or are you gas, or are you using solar or wind or hydro? That's the choice that my work sits on, is how do we supply utilities with enough green electrons and hybridize our solutions so we've got wind plus solar plus batteries to give them a more level loading so they can supply these automobiles with, these electric vehicles with power, and then they can, that changes the transmission sector.
Does the cheaper cost of wind and solar include land costs?
It includes all costs.
It's everything.
Yeah, for the life cycle of the project, absolutely.
I have a ridiculous question.
Yeah.
I keep saying General Electric, but the name of the company is GE.
Yeah.
Correct? I'm sorry for that.
Oh, that's okay.
But the reason is I played on a Little League baseball team back in the early 60s that's sponsored by General Electric, and it's just burned into my head. So then I kept realizing I was correcting myself.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you for that.
My pleasure.
The last thing I want to ask about is we're talking about hydro, for example, wind farms. There's also concern that these create their own environmental negative consequences, negative impacts. Talk a little bit about that, what GE is doing in terms of that.
Yeah, so there actually is a great dialogue happening right now. GE is a part of it, but it's much broader than GE. It's with the Department of Energy and some environmental and conservation groups and other hydro-based companies. And they're talking about the balance. I mean, there are environmental groups that want to see no new dams built, but we have several dams in the country right now that are inefficiently utilized. So there's sort of a give and take. How about there's some discussion about, can we come to an agreement about upgrading and improving these dams and removing these? So overall, the net environmental benefit is positive, but we also get more efficient use of the infrastructure that we have. So those conversations are very helpful. They're progressing, and I expect good things.
Danielle, from the company that used to be General Electric, now GE, thank you very much.
Thank you.
To talk about why Africa needs more energy, not less, please welcome the Executive Director of the Energy for Growth Hub, Todd Moss.
Good morning. Thank you. The Energy for Growth Hub is a global network delivering data and evidence to policymakers to help them build a high energy future for the 3 billion people who live on Earth in energy poverty today. I've spent my career working in research and government, working with Africans on some of their most pressing development challenges. And slowing climate change and managing the risks of climate change are critical issues for all societies. But why are Africa and its 1 billion people, why are they different when it comes to energy and climate? Let's start with 2 facts. First, Africa regionally is the least responsible for causing climate change. Even today, the average American emits 33 times as much CO2 as the average Nigerian. And fact 2, while Africans are the least responsible for climate change, they also have the most to lose. They are the most vulnerable to extreme weather, to drought, and to soaring temperatures. So Africans need to build climate resilience as quickly as possible. They urgently need the tools to adapt. Now, in the West, our climate strategy is mostly about mitigation. It's about decarbonizing our power sector and reducing our energy consumption. Now, the problem is that we are imposing our climate strategy on Africa. We are exporting a strategy of energy austerity, and we're narrowing the range of options for Africans to get the power that they need. So here's what's going on right now in energy finance. Major donors, from the European Union to private philanthropy, are insisting that Africans get their power only from renewable energy sources. The World Bank, right up the street here, is already barred from being involved in upstream oil and gas. It's under pressure, tremendous pressure, to get out of gas to power projects as well, even in the poorest countries. Now, Africa has tremendous energy needs. It also happens to have tremendous resources in natural gas. And while Western companies are developing natural gas for export in countries like Mozambique, Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal, those very same countries are finding it increasingly difficult to get finance if they want to use their own gas to generate electricity at home. Now, this strategy of energy austerity for Africa, it can't work, and worse, it's wrong. Let me tell you a little bit why. So, the first reason that energy austerity and a strategy of renewables only cannot possibly succeed as a climate mitigation strategy is because Africa's power sector is just far too small. So last year, global electricity consumption grew by 900 terawatt hours. That 1 year increase is nearly twice the amount of Africa's total electricity consumption on the entire continent. So in other words, if we strip down Africa's electricity consumption to zero, the rest of the world would add that much more power in about 6 months. And here, take a look at this slide. It makes no sense to try to block one power plant in Tanzania or Kenya, or 2 power plants in Nigeria, at a time when the United States has over 3,000 power plants running on fossil fuels. So energy austerity for Africa also cannot work because it will make it impossible for Africans to adapt to climate change. So in the face of extreme weather, people need resilient infrastructure. That means cement and steel. Facing the risk of drought, people need pumped irrigation for agriculture and desalination for fresh water. And to survive soaring temperatures, we need to keep warehouses, offices, factories, and data centers cool. So Africa is going to need more cold storage and a lot more air conditioning. Now, steel, cement, desalination, air conditioning, these are all hugely energy-intensive technologies. So the only conclusion we can draw is that because of climate change, Africa needs more energy, not less. This is actually the opposite of energy austerity. And the final reason energy austerity for Africa can't work is because it is deeply unethical. Now, we in the West are mostly failing at climate mitigation. But luckily for us, we have a backup plan. We can adapt. After storms, we can rebuild. When it gets too hot, we crank up the AC. But Africans don't have our backup. They don't have the same wealth, the same infrastructure, and especially they don't have the energy they need to adapt to climate change. Now, I work in the energy and development space, and I hear people all the time say, well, because of climate change, we just can't afford for Africans to live the lifestyles that we live. I hear this all the time, and we absolutely must reject this. Let me give you a little perspective on global energy inequality. Californians use more electricity playing video games than the entire country of Kenya. Hot tubs and swimming pools in the state of California consume more power than the entire nation of Senegal. And this is just California. Now, some of you are laughing, and some of you might be outraged, but in Africa, energy inequality is life and death. So what should we sitting here in Washington, D.C. do about it? One, we should stop imposing our climate mitigation strategy on Africa. We cannot fight climate change on the backs of the world's poor. And we cannot lift up the development ladder on 1 billion people. And second, we must find ways to finance a high energy future for everyone. Now, in the battle against climate change and poverty, we need all of our weapons. We need solar home systems and mini grids for remote areas. We need big power plants and a robust grid for cities and for industry. Now, I want to be very, very clear. Renewable energy is going to be a tremendous part of Africa's future. Wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, these all must be exploited to the absolute maximum. But in most places, renewables on their own are not enough. In many places, gas to power is going to be part of that future to provide energy at scale and to balance intermittent renewables like wind and solar. So yes, energy is the central cause of climate change. And yes, energy is a central part of the response to climate change. Everyone needs and deserves a high energy future. Climate change doesn't cancel that goal, it actually makes it more urgent. Thank you.
And now, for a session produced by our underwriter, please welcome John Paul Clark, Vice President of Strategic Technologies at United Technologies Corporation.
Morning, everyone. So now for something a little different. We've been talking a lot about ground infrastructure, and we're going to be talking for the rest of the session this morning about moving stuff and things that move. And with that said, I have a few remarks I thought I would make to sort of set the stage for the last part of this morning. I'm academic at heart, so I'll start with the economic literature. So the economic development literature, such as the work by Mellinger and Jeffrey Sachs and Gallup, suggests that temperature ecozones, or temperate ecozones, within 100 kilometers of oceans or ocean navigable waterways are 18 times more likely to have a higher GDP than those that are not. And if you look at the facts, this correlation is in part due to the fact that for centuries, only communities near waterways or near the ocean were able to trade. And this, of course, is before the advent of the locomotive and then the automobile and the aircraft. So if trade is indeed a necessary, albeit not a sufficient condition for economic development, then infrastructure and the transportation networks enabling global trade must, of course, be safe, inexpensive, and last but not least, sustainable. Safety and cost have always been an important part of transportation. New infrastructure in transportation must be safe relative to whatever societal expectations were in place at the time they were introduced. Of course, our expectations change. They usually go up. But at the time of introduction, we have to be safe relative to the expectations. And of course, it has to be inexpensive relative to how much our customers are willing to pay. Sustainability, both economic and environmental sustainability, have become a priority over the time due to diminishing availability of and access to raw materials. We all know that story. And the threat of climate change, which has been the subject of discussion today. So given safety as a fixed constraint, our objective must be to simultaneously increase the economic and environmental efficiency of transportation. And I use that phrase, economic and environmental efficiency, deliberately. i.e., we must strive to do more with less. I'll limit the remainder of my remarks to air transportation, because I decided to play it safe today and speak about something that I actually know something about. Moving billions of people around the world every year requires billions of gallons of fuel. 17.5 billion alone in 2017. In fact, the International Air Transportation Association projects that in 2018, the bill would be around $206 billion, accounting for 25% of the operating costs of the airline industry. It's estimated that the aviation industry contributes 2 to 3% of the world's human-generated carbon emissions and 12% of CO2 emissions from all transportation sources. Further, aircraft noise continues to be an issue with communities around the world. I don't need to tell anybody that one. To achieve greater economic and environmental efficiency, we need, at the very least, to answer the following 3 questions. How can we best use technology and autonomous solutions to enhance safety while at the same time increasing collaboration and optimizing workload? How can we take advantage of all the data being generated? We talk about Internet of Things and all these sensors around the world, generated across the economic aviation ecosystem to unlock new insights that deliver efficiencies for operators and more seamless and rewarding travel experiences for passengers. That's the self-interest part for me. And how can we reduce aviation's carbon footprint, noise pollution, operating, and maintenance costs? The short answer to these questions is more. More sensors, more intelligent aircraft, airline, airport, and air traffic control systems, a more connected ecosystem where human and machine agents team up, collaborate, and coordinate decision-making to achieve greater efficiencies overall, more electrification of aircraft and propulsion systems, more use of alternative propulsion architectures and fuels. How could all this sensing, intelligence, connectivity, electrification, and use of alternative architectures and fuels help us? Let's consider this all too familiar scenario, at least for me. It's a late night, and you're on a flight from New York to Denver, the last flight of the evening. The Northeast Corridor is experiencing departure delays because it's congested, and Denver is expecting snow. 30 minutes after its scheduled wheels-up time, the flight finally takes off, leaving Manhattan behind. Soon after, the pilot comes on the intercom and says, "Hi, folks. Sorry about the delay getting you off the ground, but good news, I've gotten permission from operations to fly at a faster speed, and I can recover most, if not all of the time, so that we can have an on-time arrival." Passengers settle back in their seats, relatively confident that all is well, until the plane lands. It turns out Denver's snow was worse than expected, resulting in a ton of departure delays, and everybody had to return to the gates. So, as the flight taxis to the terminal, it becomes clear that there's no gates for your airplane. And it will take half an hour until one will be open. In these scenarios, passengers have gone from unhappy to happy to really happy to unhappy again. And we burnt a ton of fuel along the way, all for no gain in time. So let's imagine an alternative scenario, a parallel universe, if you will. I have 12-year-old twins, and they live in the parallel Marvel universes all the time, so this is very good. So let us assume that there's ubiquitous sensing, precise positioning, navigation, and timing, increasingly autonomous intelligent machine systems, and a highly interconnected and secure communication network. Given these combined capabilities, which I and many others believe are possible in the near to medium term, the pilots, dispatchers, and air traffic controllers would have had high confidence forecasts of the weather and the impact of the weather on the availability of airline, airport, and airspace resources, be able to precisely predict, monitor, and control the movement of aircraft in collaboration with autonomous and highly automated systems, and thereby have the means to both predict and optimize the traffic levels throughout the air transportation system, i.e., you'd have an extra time in the lounge before you departed. You'd be boarding just about the right time, and when you arrive, you would never have a holdout, which is the term for getting there and not having a gate. So, in a connected ecosystem, every agent, whether human or machine, will have the data that's required to gain insights and be able to collaborate with other agents to achieve greater system-wide optimality. So again, you don't have to wait on the ramp. And everything will be adjusted, and you'd actually have a flight path that would not require holding, airborne holding, which is the worst thing ever, at least for me. So the economic and environmental benefits of what I've talked about before could be further amplified when combined with revolutionary new technologies such as the geared turbofan, which we built. Why I'm saying is further amplified. Well, you're going to get the efficiency from better operations, but if you have a basic thing that you're operating that's more efficient, then you get a double benefit. And so, like the geared turbofan, you can reduce the noise footprint relative to the previous engines by 75%, decrease fuel burn by 16%, and reduce regulated emissions by more than 50%. Further benefits we predict will be obtained through advanced materials like CMCs, or ceramic matrix composites, which compared to traditional materials allow you to increase the temperatures in your hot section of your engine, which means more efficiency. The utilization of parallel hybrid electric architectures are also on the horizon. This is a great tie-in with the conversations we've had before on ground infrastructure. Of course, the challenge being battery density and energy density, but we're working on that. Electrification will provide benefits over a wide range of segments. At the low end, in size, urban air mobility, you can get all electric airplanes. In the middle range, regional turboprops, you can get airplanes where 50% of the power is being supplied by electrification. At the higher end, it's a little bit more challenging because of the energy density. So you'll probably get partially hybrid. However, that will allow you to optimize the systems better and gain efficiency both in terms of electrification and also in terms of the design of your engine. In fact, some of the studies that we've done suggest that with certain architectures, aircraft engine architectures, and certain missions, you could reduce fuel burn by up to 40% through hybrid electric systems, and carbon dioxide emissions by over 20%. Further, and this is really cool, electrification can allow you to integrate your engines and all your systems in the airplane. So you can actually trade how you use the energy between propulsion and managing the energy on board the aircraft. For example, climate control systems, etc., pneumatic systems. That said, we will ultimately need a portfolio of technologies and industry proficiencies to achieve these critical economic and environmental efficiencies. With these larger technological advancements, while these are basically larger, longer-term things, because it takes a while to build the stuff and get it in the fleet, we must not forget that we can start today. As committed to at this year's past Paris Air Show by the CTOs of the largest 7 aerospace manufacturers, we as an industry are committed to both improving technology, but also to using alternative fuels in the short term. While electric-powered aircrafts are in our future, we also know that aircraft industry will require reliance on liquid fuels for decades to come. Knowing that, we need to have alternative fuels as part of our portfolio of technologies and solutions. Around 185,000 commercial flights have already been flown using alternative fuels, and basically our goal is to create fuels that can be recycled. When we achieve the scale that we need, we as an industry will have the near-term and long-term scope to succeed in getting this mission, critical mission of economic and environmental efficiencies. Thank you.
On flying through climate change, please welcome Nancy Young, Vice President of Environmental Affairs at Airlines for America, here with John Donvan.
Hi, Nancy, and welcome. I like the title of this talk, Flying Through Climate Change, because we're going to be extending the talk that we just heard to bring in the perspective of the industry that makes its living off of flying in the sky, and the sky is where weather is happening, and climate change is affecting essentially your ocean up there that you have to work in. And what are the immediate challenges? I just mean to operations that are presented by climate change as we're experiencing it now, and as we are will experience it as the temperature continues to go up.
Yeah, absolutely, great question, and thanks to JP for giving me an appetizer to build off on from that talk. Weather and the climate broadly have been huge issues for aviation since the beginning of flight, and so it's something that we're very focused on. As we are facing additional climate impacts, we are upping our game on that. So some of the challenges that you're referencing include things like on an extremely hot day in a place that might not usually be quite so hot, you have an issue about the lift that an aircraft can get, because an aircraft going down the runway displaces air, hotter air is thinner, and it's harder to get the lift to take off, for example. So
a heavy enough plane on a hot enough day would not be able really to get off the ground safely.
That's right, and you saw some of that, for example, in Phoenix a couple years back, and it's predicted that cities that are typically pretty warm but will have those kinds of temperatures because of changing climate, will have more infrastructure issues that they have to deal with. Now, you can deal with something like that. One, safety is always number one in aviation. So you're not going to fly if you're not able to meet all the safety parameters, and there are significant margins for error built in there. So it's always going to be safe. The things that you can do, you can reduce the weight of the aircraft. The aircraft manufacturers are increasingly building and certifying aircraft to be able to handle those higher temperatures.
So planes are being designed with climate change in mind?
Well, they've always been designed with temperature in mind, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
think about, we have to be able to operate at 36,000 feet in the icy, icy cold, and you need to come down, say, to the desert if you're going to the Middle East or even in the US in a hotter climate. So aircraft manufacturers have always designed to that, but the parameters of that and the certification then of the aircraft and the operating parameters of those aircraft and those temperatures have to be adjusted, and those get put across both in the aircraft and then in sort of the operating protocols for what you do with the aircraft in terms of the weight it can take, the length of the runway it needs to take off, et cetera. And I don't want to make this sound like it's happening everywhere. I mean, I'm from Kansas City, Missouri. Lots of cold, lots of warm there, for example. We're not seeing the extremes everywhere, but in certain types of climates, you would need to take this into account.
So we're all accustomed to the idea that when there are thunderstorms or blizzards, the airport's going to have to shut down. But you're also talking about a world in which just high temperatures could mean that an airport has to shut down or slow down a lot.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think like the Phoenix example, it was really just a slowdown. And in fact, it didn't affect every aircraft.
Yeah.
A number of aircraft, in fact, some of the biggest aircraft, were certified to operate in those conditions without a problem. So you really have to look at the fact that different aircraft are flying in a given airport. And I don't want to overblow that, but I think the point is, and you mentioned, winter weather, for example. Again, we work very, very closely with the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. Their National Weather Service actually has an aviation weather center, for example. And our own airlines have operations centers, and FAA has a command center, and they all interconnect with this information about weather. So we're getting real-time information as well as predictive information and feeding that into our operation. So if it's winter weather, if it's warmer weather, we're adjusting to that. But system-wide, I think you've heard in the panels today, we're all looking at what does a changing climate mean over the long run, and how do you design to that, how do you operate to that? And that's just, in a way, kind of business as usual for the airlines, since we've always had that as a big factor for us.
Let's talk a little bit about carbon emissions, because so here's an interesting thing, that the challenges that you're facing in the sky results somewhat significantly from the rise in carbon emissions. The airline industry puts carbon emissions into the atmosphere. I'm just curious, I'm looking for interesting guesses, so if you actually know the answer, that would be less interesting. I'm just want the well, I'm just being honest about it. What percentage of global carbon emissions would you estimate comes from the airline industry? I can do a show of hands. 1%? 10%? 20? Higher than 20? Okay, so we've covered the range. It's actually only 2.5%, which I found quite surprising. It's a small fraction, but 2.5% is still 2.5%, and that comes to almost 1 billion metric tons, according to the Council on Clean Energy Transportation, which is also saying that the rate of carbon emissions contributed by airlines is going up at a really fast pace. It's up 32% since 2013.
Yeah,
so that's a challenge. What's going on there?
Yeah, well, first, let me...
Do you challenge the numbers
Let me put those numbers in context, number one. I mean, and I'll use a U.S. example. For example, in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency confirms that U.S. airlines are 2% of our nation's greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So we'll look at that, and we can talk about the global too. They're certainly related. So globally, as John says, 2.5% of all the world's airlines operating around there. So we have really been focused forever, kind of like we've been focused forever on safety and weather, we've been focused on fuel efficiency. And so that's why if you think about the US airlines, we move 2.4 million passengers on average a day, 58,000 tons of cargo on average a day. We drive 5% of the GDP, and we're 2% of the nation's greenhouse gas emissions. Now, to the point about emissions growth, people want to fly, they want to ship things. Now, we've improved in the United States our fuel efficiency as US airlines 130% since 1978. So what does that mean? That means we saved 5 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide, roughly equivalent to taking 26 million cars off of the road each year since 1978. So that's how you're 2% of the greenhouse gas emissions driving 5% of GDP. Concern, growth, right? So one, I don't agree with the ICCT numbers, but yes, there is the potential for emissions growth. And the way that the industry's been addressing that, not just the airlines, but working with the airports, the airframe and engine manufacturers, and the air navigation service providers, is to set a series of climate targets. The first one was an annual average fuel efficiency improvement of 1.5% beginning in 2009 to 2020. We're exceeding that, we're at 2.3%. So the fuel efficiency is there, the growth is there, but we've outstripped the growth of emissions from the growth of aviation. So that's a good thing. Our second target is carbon neutral growth from 2020, meaning beginning in 2021, we're going to hold the growth of those carbon emissions constant. In other words, we're not going to grow those emissions. So we get the concern very much that people have that if there is emissions growth, we could take more than that 2% of the carbon budget, and 2% isn't nothing, right? You need to actually, all of us in a carbon-constrained world need to decrease. So we're gonna take growth off the table, and then we have a goal of a 50% net reduction in carbon dioxide in 2050, and we're working earnestly towards that through an array of measures, which I'm happy to talk about. JP gave you a hint or two.
So, but what I think I hear you saying is that one of the reasons that the amount of carbon emissions put out by the airline industry is going up is because more of us are flying, that there's just more aviation than there used to be. Can I do one more flash poll of the audience? Just raise your hand if you've been on an airplane in the air within the last month or plan to within the coming month. Shame on you. No, me too. But I bring up the shame question because there actually is kind of, the Swedes have now come up with this term flygskam, which means shame of flying, and there's this move towards, the Green Party in Germany is saying, let's stop the internal domestic flights inside Germany and go by train. What do you think of these? Do you think that this argument is realistic to get everybody in the room to not want to fly anymore domestically when there's an alternative? Is that a serious avenue to pursue?
Well, I mean, I think we respect that people have a concern about emissions growth, and are thinking about the things to do about that. And one of the things that, we don't think the flying shame movement is right. We think it's misplaced, but one of the kind of perverse things it's done is given us a chance to talk about our record. Like, you just asked the audience, how much CO2 do we put out? We haven't really gotten to, are you doing much about that besides your targets? But so I will do that. But people don't really know all of those things, and maybe in part it was because we were small. People were really focused on power plants and automobiles. I mean, automobiles in the United States, just the cars themselves are 17%. And when you add the rest of transportation, not with us, it adds to 26%.
Well, may I pause you for just a second just to tell the audience, if you want to send in some questions now, you can start. And let's talk about that then.
Yeah, well, let's talk about what we're doing. Yeah, absolutely. So I can give you the goals that we have. But what we're really doing is driving technology, operations, and infrastructure. And as JP mentioned, we're changing our fuel dynamic, and I'm really proud of the fact that we're leading that effort as industry by developing and deploying sustainable aviation fuels. And then you ask this question, while we fly from country to country, what are you going to do? You hear things about carbon offsets, you hear things about emissions trading or carbon taxes. What we did is worked for several years with the governments under our body, the United Nations body that sets our standards, the International Civil Aviation, to come up with 2 agreements on climate action. One, a carbon dioxide standard for future aircraft that goes into effect in 2020, and the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation. The acronym is CORSIA, and that is part of how we're going to meet this carbon neutral growth from 2020 goal. In 2021, this offsetting system kicks in. So we're going to keep driving through technology. Lighter aircraft, more efficient aircraft, as JP mentioned. Every generation is about 15 to 20% more fuel efficient. And aircraft engines like the geared turbofan that Pratt & Whitney UTC developed help us do that. The winglets you see on the end of our planes, when you see them tip up, they bring aerodynamics from 3 to 6% improvement. So more fuel efficiency. The infrastructure, I think, is a big thing. And JP was mentioning a bit of that interconnectivity of information. We got a challenge in the United States. We have had an opportunity to transition to a modernized air traffic management system over the last many years from the radar-based system. And because of a number of bureaucratic and structural issues, our government that controls the air traffic management system has not been able to implement that fully. Well, if they did, the original estimate was we would get about 12% emission savings. There's that inefficiency in the system you would gain through modernization. But the Inspector General confirms that hasn't happened. So we're trying to work very closely with FAA and Congress to get that program going.
So as you mentioned the FAA, I mean, we're in a period now after Boeing's recent safety scandals. There's been a lot of questioning about whether deregulation of the airline industry went too far. Those sorts of things may not have happened if the regulations had been in place. And I want to bring that question to the issue of climate mitigation and the airlines. And the airlines spend a great deal of money lobbying Congress, so it has influenced $6.5 million last year. And the question is, and everything that we're talking about, is there a place for the FAA or some other federal agency to be involved in setting rules and regulations, tighter rules and regulations for the airline industry in terms of climate emissions, in carbon emissions?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, we work very closely with them, and they actually already do regulate us. So let me give a couple of examples. Well, one, let's talk about what you do without regulation. So when I talked about sustainable aviation fuels, in 2006, FAA, my organization, Airlines for America, the Aerospace Industries Association, and the airports banded together to create the Commercial Aviation Alternative Fuels Initiative. That's a public-private initiative. And why did we do that? Because everybody focused on ground-based alternative fuels forever. In fact, back in the 70s, that started being subsidized. Well, nobody was focusing on this, so we had to create that industry. So working with our government, we've done things like that. FAA has the Continuous Lower Energy Emissions and Noise Program, another public-private program that we and the manufacturers participate to advance technology and operations. To the regulation side, FAA itself is the one that's implementing for U.S. airlines and business jet operators the carbon offsetting reduction scheme for international aviation. I mentioned that it was agreed internationally by 193 countries by treaty. The United States has stayed in that agreement. You think about the United States stepping away from Paris Agreement, we've stayed in the CORSIA Agreement, and FAA is implementing it. So yeah, there's certainly a role. I should also mention that
I'm actually asking more of a role. I mean, are you?
Yeah, well, I'll give another example. The Environmental Protection Agency under the Clean Air Act has the authority and in fact has set a number of regulations for oxides of nitrogen, carbon monoxide, particulate matter, et cetera, from aircraft. Right now, they are poised to adopt the carbon dioxide certification standard that I mentioned was agreed at the international level in 2016. So there are things that they can do to overlay a carbon offsetting scheme through FAA, EPA adopting the internationally agreed standard for aircraft, and interestingly, industry wants these things to happen because our environmental interests in avoiding and minimizing climate impacts.
You would gain too.
We need to contribute to that, right? We need to contribute to the climate mitigation issues, number one. We also have an economic incentive in reducing fuel burn. It's the number one or number two cost for airlines in any given year, and they compete with each other on routes. So the more fuel efficient you are, hence the more carbon efficient you are, the better you're going to do.
It's a very interesting paradox and one we're all going to be thinking about as we all certainly continue to fly. Nancy, thank you so much for joining us.
To discuss the future of fuel standards, please welcome Spencer Reeder, Director of Government Affairs at Audi of America, here with Atlantic staff writer Robinson Meyer.
It's so nice. We started the day with talking about utilities, a place where carbon emissions are already falling, and we get to talk to transportation, the next zone. I should also ask, we were just discussing this backstage, you work for Audi. They let you drive an Audi, right?
Indeed. Yeah. They let me. Yeah.
They let you. Do you enjoy? Tell us briefly. Electric?
Absolutely. Yeah. The Audi e-tron, our first all-electric vehicle. And as we were talking backstage, I'm very much into the outdoors. I live in California. I'm a skier. Audi came out, as some of you may know, with their first all-electric vehicle. It's a fully capable Audi SUV, much in the sort of spirit of the Q5 or Q7. It sort of sits in between those two models. It's got a roof rack, an operable sky.
That's great. This is
all that stuff. So
perfect.
Yep.
Great. Audi.
You asked the question.
No. I did. No. This is me. Knowing I'm playing the Dr. Frankenstein role here. So this past summer, let's first talk about fuel efficiency and economy, and then we'll go back to electrification. And this past summer or this past year, the Trump administration said it would roll back the fuel economy standards. In fact, it would freeze them at 2020 levels for 5 years. What's the environmental impact of a change like that if we were to freeze the CAFE and GHG standards?
Well, let me answer your question in a slightly different way. And you mentioned the Paris Accord. That was part of a number of panels. Audi, which is part of the Volkswagen Group, has been very explicit about our support for the Paris Agreement on climate change. We are committed to year-over-year reductions in CO2 emissions from our vehicle fleets, and that really then necessitates a continuing improvement in fleet fuel economy. So for us, it's really not a question of any type of regulatory framework. We're doing this with our fleet. So, we support that for the industry, regardless of what happens in terms of the rollback or not. Audi and Volkswagen Group more generally are going to continue to improve our fuel economy throughout the fleet. And we, listen, it's unquestionable that you don't hit the transportation carbon targets without doing that.
Though it's Audi is operating in a slightly different segment, but it's generally to the economic detriment of companies that kind of go it alone with fuel economy reductions if the whole industry isn't following them. Is that right? In other words, it does add to the cost of a car. It works out for consumers. Consumers save money over time if there's fuel economy adjustments, but it does increase the sticker price of the car to have fuel economy improving technology on there. Is it bad for some of the companies to kind of go it alone on these emissions, or to have to go it alone on these improvements?
We don't necessarily think in the context of the U.S. or even North America. We're a global company. Volkswagen arguably is the largest auto manufacturer on the planet. So we've got Europe in mind. We've got what's happening in China in mind. We're making a $34 billion investment in electrification alone. And so for us, there is no turning back. We're essentially betting the farm on this transformation that's occurring. The question for us, certainly within the U.S. context, which I focus on, is how quickly is that transformation going to occur? What's the role of other potential alternative fuels? So there are some interesting questions. However, I would just say that, this is a global commitment we're making from the very top, and we've been very unambiguous about that.
Yes, and so I just want to hit two more things before we go. The first is that Audi is working with California to on a local emissions project on an effort to keep emission standards low in that state. Can you tell us anything about that?
Well, we've committed. Actually, the interesting thing here, yes, we have been collaborating with California on making sure that we are consistent with their climate objectives, but it's a national program for us. What we do in California is what we do across the country. The vehicle fuel efficiency standards that we agree to with California will be the standard we use for all 50 states. Our electric vehicles are not just being sold in California or in the ZEV compliant states. We're selling that vehicle in every state. All 300 plus of our dealerships are prepared to sell all of our EVs. So,
but there are other automakers who are either fighting those standards or claiming that there are kind of multiple different emission standards across the country due to California, right? Are they right? Is that the right thing to be doing?
Yes, in theory, you could make the argument that there are these different state, it's the California plus the ZEV states that have that standard, and that if the federal government diverges, then you do have this sort of bifurcation in the regulatory framework that creates more work for everybody. It's not the ideal solution. We've been clear, and I think the industry associations, have been consistent in saying that the better solution is like what we achieved with the Obama administration, which is a unified program that harmonizes California's regulatory aims with that of the federal government, and that's better and easier and cheaper for everybody.
The Trump administration, due to Audi's work with California, has now opened or has said they're looking into antitrust claims against the four companies, one including the Volkswagen Group and Audi, that worked with California to produce these lower standards. Is that right?
That's correct. That's about all I can comment on.
Yeah, do you want to say anything else?
No. I think the Department of Justice is down here somewhere. So.
They can't hear it. Do you think that's a good state of affairs for, say, American decarbonization in the transportation sector?
I'll take that as a rhetorical question.
Could I ask one last question, which is, when you look at the documents that have come out for the national policy for this freeze at 2020, do you have a sense that the regulators and the regulating agencies understand how cars work?
Actually, it's arguable whether or not the cars or the regulatory framework are more complex in this case. If you dig into the CAFE standards and how they've been formulated, it is a fairly complex regulatory framework. So yeah, listen, I think there's good intentions throughout the federal agencies working on this, and there's a long history of fuel economy work at EPA and at the US DOT. So I think there's a lot of well-intentioned folks that are trying to sort of thread the needle here. I think for us, again, a couple of statistics. We're going to build within the Volkswagen Group 70 models by the time the Olympics come back to LA. I'm in California, 2028. We'll have 70 plug-in models representing a volume of 22 million vehicles over this time period. And so, the regulatory stuff is really important. I get paid to sort of dig into this. But from the company strategy standpoint, this is where we're heading. Mm-hmm. The Volkswagen Group is going electric. And
not on a compliance car basis. This is not
a compliance issue for us. This is more of an existential decision that has been made at the very top. Dr. Deese, who heads the Volkswagen Group, has made a lot of public statements recently about our commitment to addressing climate change, about the necessity for doing this. We think it's a better experience for our consumers.
Yeah. This
is where things are heading. If you get the chance to drive in the Audi e-tron, you'll see what I mean. They're great vehicles. From a performance standpoint, from an experiential standpoint, it allows us to move towards automation as well. So the whole sort of industry is going to go this way. We want to be a leader. That's why we're doing this.
It is this crazy thing because all the electric vehicles basically, or many of them, have this insane 0 to 60 statistic because electric motors are so good at torque.
Right.
And it has been very fortuitous for the transition thus far that this one statistic that car people kind of tend to focus on and which is 0 to 60, also lines up really well with the technical capacity of electric motors. Right. Where are we on electrification? So obviously Audi's doing a lot. In fact, it laid off 20,000 workers in Germany in the past week. As part of that transition to electrification, I'm going to talk about that in a second.
Well, just to clarify, Audi's number is 9,000.
Audi's number is 9,000. Yeah. Volkswagen Group laid out.
Audi's number is 9,000.
Audi's number is 9,000.
Yeah.
Where are we on electrification? Are we talking about ARPANET in 1981? Or are we talking about natural gas and it's 2009 and this thing is about to wash over us and completely change the grid just due to market forces?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think nationally we're still hovering around maybe closer to 2% adoption of EVs. So it's not a foregone conclusion that we get there quickly enough to address some of the climate crisis issues that we've been talking about today. So I think there's an ecosystem around the vehicle that has to also accelerate commensurate with our objectives. And I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on the infrastructure side, also on consumer awareness. There was and I'll be really quick, UC Davis ran a survey in California, the leading state for EV adoption, where they asked the public, they did I can't remember what the sample size was, how many of you can name an EV? 70% of the people couldn't name one. And of the 30%, plus or minus, and of the 30% or so that could, about 40% of them got it wrong. So even in California, there's this...
not an EV.
Right. Even in California, there's this great need for additional consumer awareness. Audi's been running a pretty robust marketing campaign, but I think we still have a long ways to go in terms of awareness and education. And then once you get there, you still have the infrastructure side.
And on the infrastructure side, is this going to require public investment at this point, or will charging...
I mean, Volkswagen Group's making a $2 billion investment, somewhat, wasn't voluntary.
Yeah, I was going to say, the Volkswagen Group here has done, I would say, more to electrify the fleet in this country than just about other entities.
But Tesla's another example of a company that did make that private investment. I think it's going to be a public-private partnership. There'll be investments from the utility sector, from other resources. I think it's going to be an all hands on deck.
Do you see the utilities keep catching up here? Are utilities kind of eager to capture all the energy market share they're about to get coming off fossil and going to the grid?
For those of you that follow the utility sector, I would say the last 6 to 8 months have been unbelievable in terms of the sort of wildfire spread. No pun intended, we're having wildfires in California. But the spread of sort of awareness and activity in this space in terms of EV charging in the energy space, it's the last 8 months have been really unbelievable. So I think you see many, many more utilities and their commissions now much more engaged.
Does Audi talk to utilities like, hey, FYI, 70 plug-in models, like?
We do, yeah, we do. We helped launch the Alliance for Transportation Electrification, which is primarily a utility-led group, but we are one of the OEMs that are part of that group, really to help engage in the conversation with utilities themselves, their commissions, the stakeholders around the energy space, because we think that this convergence of transportation and energy is really key, and we think it has to be done well to succeed.
No, there are other alternate fuels here. People talk about hydrogen. Some of the still have significant regulatory support from California. There was a time where we would have talked about this race between electrification and hydrogen in terms of decarbonized vehicles. Do you think we're still in that race, or do you think electrification at this point has won?
Yeah, this is a topic that people approach with a lot of passion and emotions. I have to be careful. There's hydrogen fans. I will admit, Audi has a hydrogen fuel cell technology we've been developing as the lead sort of R&D arm within the Volkswagen Group, and we have that. And in Europe, the context is actually different. In California, for light-duty vehicles, it appears that electrification is sort of the winning horse. In the medium and heavy duty, there's still an open debate. And who knows? I mean, 5 years from now, maybe we'd have a different view, around the hydrogen fuel cell in the light duty space. I think there's still a competition, but clearly, if you look at just the raw data in terms of the number of EV charging stations versus the number of hydrogen refueling stations, there's a diverging trend.
We're going to go to questions in a minute, so open Slido and get your questions ready. Do you see consumers starting to account for electrification? Do you see people, especially in the segment, the kind of upmarket segment that Audi works in, do you see consumers beginning to delay gas vehicle purchases? Do you see any sense that people know a transition's coming?
Yeah, again, it's mixed. I mean, if only 15% of the market is even aware, then it's hard to argue that the bulk of consumers are making a conscious choice for EVs. Although you have certain markets like the Bay Area, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle, parts of Colorado now, even parts of Texas, Austin, where you have a little bit more fluency in the consumer base, and they're making those choices for environmental reasons, but also just the coolness factor. And I think there's this phrase, butts and seats, ride and drives are really key. When someone experiences the vehicle, then it sort of transforms the way that they think about that car, the way they talk about it to their friends and network. And that sort of word of mouth networking effect we think is really important on the marketing side. We ran a Super Bowl ad around our electric vehicle. We ran ads during the Emmys, a lot of the major sporting events. So we're doing our side on the marketing side, but we think it's a combination of things that's going to generate that consumer demand.
You're a climate scientist by training. How much, in terms of getting the transportation sector to zero emissions, how much are EVs going to be able to do that? I mean, are we not going to need more and better public transit options, more and better mass transit options, whether that's through public investment or not? If everyone had an electric car, I suppose carbon emissions from gasoline would be quite down. But actually, for a number of reasons, some air pollutants would be up, and traffic would be a nightmare everywhere. So how much of this can actually happen through electrification of vehicles?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I'm a bike commuter. I work for a car company. I ride my bike to work. I love public transportation. I moved to California from Seattle.
Seattle's one
of the few cities that actually saw an increase in transit ridership. But if you look at transit statistics across the country, it's been down. So I don't think, I don't think we can be too sanguine about transit being the solution. Even though I'm a willing public transit participant. The attachment to the single occupant vehicle is going to be here for a while at least. So I think all of those have to be electrified. For everything that California's done, transportation emissions continue to go up, shockingly.
Do you think car companies have a role in saying anything about public transit, in promoting it at all?
Listen, I was at a Smart Cities conference and I talked about walkable communities. I mean, I'm not sure everyone in my company is happy about that, but we are looking at
German
mobility.
cities are quite walkable.
We're looking at mobility sort of broadly. We know that there's going to be a lot of vehicles sold for the foreseeable future, and so Audi wants to make sure we offer the most compelling selection of electric vehicles. Because listen, I don't think we get to the climate goals without electrifying the light-duty vehicle. It's absolutely critical.
What is your message for other car companies? Audience question. GM, Fiat Chrysler, Toyota that have sided with the Trump administration and supported the rollback of CAFE standards.
It's not my place to talk to those folks. They can see what we're doing. So,
Toyota doesn't even have an electric vehicle right now, I believe.
I'll let others comment on the other OEMs.
I asked my last question. Let's talk about the mix in Europe for a bit. I mean, do you think electrification of vehicles? Well, let me actually ask this: what can the U.S. Audi's a German company. Mm-hmm. What can the U.S. learn from how Europe has tackled decarbonization and decarbonizing transportation so far?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, for those of you that are following this topic at all, you know that Norway has been sort of held up as the great example. I mean, it's not really an analog because they have this incredible tax on vehicles that they can basically then create. It's an economic decision for people in Norway. It's cheaper to buy a Tesla than it is to buy a Volkswagen Golf diesel because of the way that their tax structure is. But it is the ecosystem. Like, how are you incentivizing people, giving them access to carpool lanes, which is a big advantage in California. There's these other things, non-financial incentives that governments can weigh in on to create that kind of draw. To build out the demand. I mean, it is really the demand side of the equation that we really have to continue to look at. Like, how do you build demand for these vehicles?
Like consumer demand. How do you transfer consumer demand? Volkswagen Group was caught faking emissions tests for their cars, as you are aware. Mm-hmm. Why should consumers believe the company is committed to combating climate change now?
Yeah, I don't think people need to believe. I think they just need to watch us and make sure that they, I think we need the world to continue to watch us closely and by our actions. So don't believe it, convince yourself through our actions. Look at the vehicles that are going to be in the market. Look at our sales. Look at our marketing strategy. Is there any other OEM marketing electric vehicles to the scale that Audi is?
Does that continue down to the dealer level? Because historically dealers have been less willing to sell EVs.
Yeah, if you know anything about franchise law, it's a state-by-state framework, and we are limited in our ability to control dealerships. We can't control them, in fact, but we can create the right incentive structures. All of our dealers are selling. Like I said, this is a 50-state strategy for Audi. This isn't just selling into those markets where we think we can sell them. All of our dealerships have been primed for the EV revolution. But listen, the whole, the dealership experience that people, I think, rightly sort of criticize in terms of this new technology, that's going to evolve, and we're doing as much as we can as an auto manufacturer to get our dealers ready for this transition.
Great. Well, hey, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And thank you all for being here today.
Audi's Spencer Reeder and the Atlantic's Rob Meyer, and thank you to all our speakers and moderators, from feeling the heat to flight and a changing climate to the future of fuel standards. We covered rich and important territory this morning. I hope you all leave here feeling invigorated by the conversation, that you learned something new or were inspired by somebody you saw on the stage. Before you dash out the door, please join me once again in thanking our underwriters. They are BASF, United Technologies, and McKinsey & Company. They made today possible, and we're enormously grateful for their support. We're enormously grateful to all of you. Thank you for spending so much time with all of us. Have a wonderful day.